Welcome, Wargamers, to the fascinating and savage world of Aea, as I dive into the lore of a game that has absolutely enraptured me lately, and that game, of course, is Conquest, the Last Argument of Kings by Bellum. Now, I'll be honest, whenever I get into a new game system or a setting to kind of drink in its lore, it is like drinking from a fire hydrant, and that's not helped by the fact that this game has some incredibly deep wells of narrative, right? There's powerful characters, dastardly villains, you have primordial evils, and heroes aplenty. And so in this video, I wanted to give an extremely broad introduction to the setting, and if you're a fan of Conquest and the lore behind it, you will note that I am leaving a few things out. Hold on, we're going to get there. This is the start of a new series of videos kind of tackling this incredibly deep universe. And so these videos are meant to be initial introductions, and then we can fill in the details later. So what is the setting and feel of Conquest, the Last Argument of Kings? Well, the story takes place on the world of Aea, as mentioned before. That's like EA. A rich and full world created by ancient forces that we'll discuss here in a minute, and while this is a planet, the story thus far has really been limited to one continent on it, though others are alluded to. It's important to note up front that there are other planets and star-faring races within the universe. And while space travel may not seem very fantasy, it's kind of leans into more of the sci-fi stuff, there's a lot of amazing ways it is brought into the fantastic realm. This is some dark fantasy stuff that is incredible. So what I'm going to do right now is give like I said, a super abbreviated overview of the history, right? Getting us to the present times of Conquest. And it might seem a bit odd at points, but buckle up because it is very cool the way it all plays out in terms of storytelling. So in the beginning, there were two primordial forces, creation and destruction. And they had this cycle. Creation would bloom things into existence and destruction would devour them, right? There were polar opposites, kind of like a yin and a yang in a way, always clashing with one another. Until at one point, their feud went nuclear. Creation was shattered into thousands and thousands of pieces, which we know as the sun and stars. These are shards of creation, the being, and destruction was wounded terribly, and so it kind of curled up for a bit of a nap. In this space of time where creation and destruction were both silent or both kind of taken out of action, a third primordial being came into existence, known as balance. Now I'm going to pause there and explain something. In other fantasy properties like Age of Sigmar and 40k, certainly things that we cover here on the channel, primordial beings have names: Slaanesh, Khorne, Tzeentch, etc. In Conquest, these beings are so large and incomprehensible that no name really fits, or they simply don't answer to a specific name, so we only know them by concepts. Concepts like creation, destruction, balance, and so on. And I want to clarify that because it's going to sound like I'm being really wordy and that kind of thing. It would be like if instead of calling him Khorne, we just said rage, right? It's the same idea. That word exemplifies what Khorne is. He just doesn't have like a colloquial name. Okay, so we'll go back to our story here. I'm going to yada a bit because these three original entities each clashed and struggled and fought against one another. And in so doing, they birthed even more primordial spirits. Famine, created by the unsatiated hunger of destruction. Destruction's used to eating all the bits of creation. Now it's like hurt, and in a nap, it's not, so its hunger literally took its own form. We call it famine. Conquest was created by the shards of creation trying to reunify and subdue famine. War was created by the battle of creation and destruction. And finally, death, a curse that was placed upon creation to limit the spread of life. And now it might sound a bit crazy, this fundamentally sets up the powers at play on Aea. You have three truly primordial forces: creation, destruction, and balance, and what's known as the four horsemen: famine, conquest, war, death. Each of these not only represents a part of the very real pantheon of gods that, followers devote themselves to, but they're all these paths to power that folks can tap into. Again, it's not dissimilar to AOS and the Chaos Gods in that regard. But some are good, others not so much. The basic idea is that As new concepts are kind of introduced into reality, they take on a spiritual form. So like before, creation and destruction and balance all started fighting, there was no war. Why? Because they started the first war. And so that's when war was born. So there's this whole drama that really brought about all of them. I'm abbreviating it quite a bit because I wanted to kind of get a little bit more forward in the story. All of this turbulence goes into founding this planet. And it's important to note that this drama between these ancient forces is also going on across the void in other places as well, birthing strange worlds and beings capable of crossing the stars. One of the earliest of these more mortal beings were the dragons, who came to Ea out of fascination with the burgeoning life there. Not long after them came the Spire, a race that is certainly going to demand a full video all its own. And I'll be honest, this moment in time, if we're following the linear storyline, it's where things get really hard to cover, and it's for a great reason. The lore of these factions is so well fleshed out and intertwined into how they fit into the setting, it's really hard to explain one without including another. Everything is connected, just like it is in the real world. And so for the next few bits, I'm going to give a super brief summary of each faction, how they developed, but understand that these things are all happening concurrently. And I'll be going into way more detail as I cover each faction and the historical events that happen in this setting in their own videos. So let's start with the Spire. They're my favorite right now. They came to the planet as colonists, looking to expand their ancient empire with the rich natural resources of the planet. They formed these incredibly elaborate towers, or spires, as their homes and dotted everything. They're just kind of all over the place at random, seemingly. This kind of colony that was forming, it was full of scientists and engineers, because that's what you need to go and start building a new civilization. The colony quickly turned into a bit of a lifeboat, because the Spire's homeworld was ultimately destroyed by a force that they refused to ever speak about, which I'm guessing, in my opinion, will probably be a future faction when it's introduced. And in a sense, the faction of the Spire fill the fantasy role of elves, ancient beings of sophisticated society far above the mundane concerns of mortals, but that's pretty much where the similarity ends, as they are masters of what's called Biomancy, and craft their bodies and their armies from the biomass of Ea. So that's the Spire in a paragraph. Let's chat Dwaghome, another faction. See, the Spires arrived on the planet where the dragons and another ancient race lived. And as the dragons began to procreate, they realized their children had half the power of their parents. Meaning, as they bred and more generations passed, these mythical creatures that defied imagination and could travel the void sort of devolved in a way to a more classic dragon, like drakes and, kind of how we see dragons typically depicted in art and stuff like that. These younglings, desiring more power and status that they can never get to rival their parents, struck a deal of sorts with the Spire and learned the art of biomancy. Again, it's a magic that allows you to manipulate organic life. And with this ability, they birthed a servant race, made especially to act as slaves and cater to the whim of these younger dragons. This was the birth of the dwarves. Over several centuries, these curious creations served their masters, but slowly began to gain a small sentience of their own. In due time, a revolution took place. The dwarves, who cast off the shackles of the dragons as their lords. I mean, this is some dark stuff, because it was not like they were happy servants. This was like a subjugation type thing. The slaves who revolted renamed themselves the Dwaghome, a new name to define their freedom. The dragons were either executed, or in some cases, the tables turned and they were the ones who were enslaved. As of the time of recording, from what I can read, there are 2 known dragons that have taken physical form that are out there, and 2 that remain creatures of the heavens. So that means there's 2 dragons locked up in the dwarven keeps. And the introduction to the Spire, the subjugation of dragons, that's all stuff that happened sort of in a mythical time period before mankind really came onto the scene. So we're going to move forward a little bit towards present time. We're almost there. Mankind is finally evolving into the people and the society that we know, and essentially divide in 2. There's the Nords, a tribal culture based on might and war that live in the far frigid north, and the other form what's called the Dominion, an immense empire in the southeast of the continent. Now, I don't want to touch on the Dominion too much, as it's one of those things, like I said, it requires its own video, but understand that there was this massive empire that reached all kinds of cool technological and societal heights, and when it collapsed, it really is the match that set this setting on fire. The refugees from that collapse of the Dominion moved west and founded a unified humanity, which quickly falls apart from internal power grabs and squabbling. Why? Because humans, that's why. Makes sense, checks out. And this collective of warlords, kings, and tyrants form the 100 Kingdoms, the human faction of the game. Now, there's more than 100 separate provinces, but there's like 100 main recognized ones. Now, lastly are the Wadrun, the newest faction to be released by Bellum. Honestly, Orcs on Dinosaurs is my sales line to you. Go check them out. It's the best thing ever. And this, like I said, is their universe's version of Orcs, which were bioengineered soldiers made by the Spire that quickly took on a life of their own in the desolate wastes of Aea. Their primitive culture has bred incredibly strong warriors that are intrinsically in tune with many of the primordial forces that we talked about. So, like, when I say that, what I mean is, for real, they can do a war chant and tap into the powers of famine or death or conquest and so on. And that's actually rules in their game. It's incredibly cool. And that, my friends, is a painfully brief intro to the setting and the factions that are currently available to be played. I can't say enough how much I oversimplified the lore for each faction in the setting, because like other fantasy settings, we have ancient gods, elder races from afar, we got dragons, we got dwarves, orcs, knightly humans, and so on, but underpinning all of that are some fantastic twists on classic fantasy, right? The subjugation and revolt of the dwarves, how they become Dwaghome. What separates that intellectual property from the generic dwarves is that these guys are angry. They have tapped into the force of war, specifically like the primordial force. If you want like a chaos dwarf style faction, these guys are rad, like for real. The idea of the orcs or the Wadrun being created as a weapon of war that kind of took on a life of its own. Yes, you'll have people in the comments being like, oh, so it's just 40k? And it's like, yes, if you need to boil everything down to what GW says it is, sure. But the truth is, using crafts like Biomancy, which was brought from somewhere else to Aea, which has then took on a life of its own, because without that kind of injection of, I guess, magical lore or thinking, we wouldn't have the Dwaghome, the dwarves, we wouldn't have the Wadrun. It just changes things immensely. The Spire are interesting to me because, I mean, I kind of softly say that they're like the elf, type in this setting, but they're very different because, like I said, biomancers that mold their environment into themselves, okay? So you have, if you're by an ocean, you'll have Spire that look like they have take on elements of seashells and rock and sand and water, whereas ones in deep forest will have like wood and flora and all kinds of cool stuff. You also have humans that have risen to incredible heights within the Dominion and its collapse into darkness and evil. Within the 100 Kingdoms, kind of the humans act as our window into the setting. You have kings that all have to fight for their claim on the throne, desperately trying to reunite the forces of man, while you have rugged survivors in the north raiding and plundering and dedicating themselves to war, referring to the Nords. And so let's end this video like I end all my videos, talking about why is this so cool? Well, for me personally, I love departures from Tolkien fantasy. I find Tolkien stuff, to be honest, a bit boring. I know it's a cardinal sin to say, but it is. And here we have motivations and races and entire species of mortals who are thrust together on one world, each with their own identity and history and reasons for doing what they're doing. The world of Aea is vast, even though so far we've only seen like one continent of it. It has rolling plains and towering mountains, desolate wastes, frozen tundras, and more. And I love that because no matter which army you choose, they all have a reason to be where they are, right? And a reason to move and interact with other races. So kind of the thing I think about is like when I was playing Fantasy Battles back when that was around, you would have this setup where it's like, okay, well, why is X army here in the desert fighting Tomb Kings, right? And you had to really like do some mental gymnastics about why that's happening. I don't feel that way here. The way that factions have spread, again, I can't emphasize enough, I simplified things. The way factions have spread out across the setting makes these battles and encounters and seeing how the characters in their lore with their interactive lore map online, they all have a reason to move places and interact with other armies, and I like that. The Spire are spread far and wide all over the planet, as are the holds of the Dwaghome. The races of man are always expanding. The Nords just raid, so they just go anywhere. Like, they're just looking for a fight. And the Wadrun, which have just now entered the scene, as they are just being released right now, are looking to carve out a home for themselves. Now, in the description, I've put a link to the Bellum Living World map where you can learn more about each faction and many of its heroes and champions, but rest assured, I'll be diving hard into the lore of this game more and more in time. If you want to follow along with me getting into it, I am going to be doing a Path of Conquest, not challenge, but like a slow grow league online, which you can find most notably probably on Instagram. It's where I'm be posting a lot of the pictures of my stuff. I am doing the Spire, and I think it's going to be an immense amount of fun. These models are so cool to paint. Quite frankly, a lot taller. Like, the base human is about as tall as a Stormcast, which makes the dwarf models, the Dwaghome, look really huge and really cool. So I would definitely encourage you to go check them out. If you have any questions about the game, you can go ahead and ask me in the comments down below. And if you're looking to actually get started in it, I do have a special code to get you 10% off. And what's cool about Bellum, if you wanted to join me in this Conquest slow grow thing, basically, unlike GW, they do all kinds of crazy deals where if you get the starter set, they'll give you an extra set of models for free for each side of the set, just to kind of get you into the game. So anyway, there's some cool stuff out there. I'm really excited to jump into the lore for this world, and I hope that you will join me as well. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming. Welcome, wargamers, to the dark fantasy world of Conquest, rich in organic material, which is perfect for today's subject, the Spire. Now, I'm going to gush here just for a moment. I've learned more about the setting and the factions of Conquest, and I have come to absolutely love the Spire. And I'll be honest, at first I didn't. I thought the designs were weird. They had this kind of Dark Souls vibe, but I kept getting little tidbits from people, how they collect biomass, and they use a form of construct, but not really, and so on. And I couldn't balance with what I was hearing in the lore, from when I hear the game creators talk, that they are essentially filling the role of elves within this setting. Like, that doesn't sound like elves that I understand. Anyway, but the more I learned and put these units into context, the more I fell in love with them. To the point where they are now my hashtag Path of Conquest army, which is a slow grow league online. So today I would like to do the same for you. Put the Spire into context and explain what makes them so cool. One thing I do want to throw out there, if you are interested in starting Conquest, you can actually save 10% off your entire first order. That's on top of any deals and discounts from Bellum by using the link and my product code down below. It does go to supporting the channel, just to be perfectly honest, but it saves you money and gets more people into an awesome game. If you would use that, it means the world to me. But now let's transition into asking, who are the Spire? Well, they are a race of near immortal beings that originate from a world among the stars. The specifics of how they mastered space travel are not explained, but to be honest, the simple mortals here on Aea wouldn't understand it even if it was explained to them. Right? They arrived on this planet millennia ago as explorers. Their homeworld was expanding, and so they set out amongst the stars in the hope of colonizing new worlds. Aea, the setting of Conquest, was one such world. To this end, the planet was colonized by these colossal towers, or spires, made of an organic material that some think was grown and molded from the earth upwards. Others believe that these are the actual ships, the crafts, that carried the Spire themselves. Again, they're so old, people don't really have an idea of what's going on. We just see these colossal biological structures and we're like, I don't get it. What is known is that each of these towers is a mega city unto itself. They house entire populations of what are called exiles, that's just the alien race, that are the Spire. I'll explain why in a second, but it has higher populations, it has factories, research centers, banks of biomass. And these towers are not just built upwards, but also downwards. They dig deep into the earth. The size and scope of each spire is truly massive when you consider the space it occupies below ground. And the whole time, it's like roots of a tree. It's sucking nutrients and raw materials from the earth around it. And, like if we as humans were colonizing a new planet, we'd have some pretty strict selections when it comes to our pioneers or the first folks to travel. This race sent out their scientists, geologists, basically city planners, resource hunters, basically anyone who can come to the planet and study it and prepare the world for full-scale colonization. This initial wave of settlers spread wide all over the surface of the planet, and deeply studied it as they waited for the rest of their race to follow. But here's the thing, that never happened. Instead of getting their population to come in and start kind of filling up the ranks and expanding on this new world, they had a flood of desperate refugees pour into the system, fleeing from their homeworld of the Spire in fear and terror. Now, here's the thing. We don't know exactly what happened on their homeworld. If there was some big threat or another alien army, the Spire refused to speak of what happened to their people. All we know is that a very few Spire made it through to Ea, and they were trickling in, and those already on the planet were getting secondhand accounts of something truly awful happening to their home. Now, it's important to note here that the way their society is organized is through what's called lineages, specific bloodlines or households that can be followed to establish your place in society. It's the same thing as saying like nobles and lords, right? They use genealogy as their proof of superiority, and I bring this up for a very important reason, because the last of these refugees to make it to Ea was named Sovereign. A truly ancient being, but not of the highest lineage in this society. Well, when Sovereign came through the void, he sabotaged the way home in an act known as the Betrayal. The justification for this was that he was protecting these people, now referred to, as I said, as the exiles, from whatever was killing them on their homeworld. Basically, he was like, the refugees were pouring in, something's happening back home, and I destroyed the path so that whatever it was couldn't follow us here. I'm the savior of our race, I kept us alive, we would be dead if I didn't do what I did. But that's the problem, is it's about optics. It didn't look that way to the other exiles. Because, even though Sovereign wasn't the highest pinnacle of authority on their homeworld, he guaranteed that he would be the top of the pyramid on Ea. Essentially saying, Sovereign shut the door before any competition came onto the scene. And that's an extremely transparent act of hubris and selfishness that was visible for everybody. It's like, okay, so you were the first of the bigwigs to make it through the refugee line, and you shut the door behind you so that you would be the biggest and the baddest and the most powerful here. So at this point, the exile society begins to waver. This is a colonization crew, not intended to be, a sole refugee camp of an entire race of, beings from space. And so their minds kind of divide into three different factions or camps, if you were. There's the Spire, as we know them, obviously the subject of today's video. There's the Weavers, and then there are the Quiet. It's one race, the exiles, with three responses to a kind of calamity that we can't really even fathom. The Spire, as we know them in the game, are the only ones who kept to the traditions and the values of their original homeworld. This is the camp that Sovereign fell into, which makes sense because, by the standards of the old world, of course, he's in charge. He's the longest, most powerful lineage there is. The Weavers and the Quiet are factions we don't know a ton about right now, so I'll have dedicated videos on them when we learn more. But essentially, they looked at this event as a reset button for their race and moved on to follow their different values. They didn't want to stick with tradition, but the Spire did, and they hunkered down, which is certainly a reaction that many people would have, right? Stick to your guns, do what we know, we're just going to rebuild our race the way it was here on a new world. But it raises a whole bunch of problems, because their society doesn't work the same way now. This is a bunch of scientists and engineers who have been here for millennia, and one noble house that just walks in and says, okay, I'm in charge now. And people are like, that's not how this works, buddy. These smart people don't just become your blind following subjects, and so they turned to some less moral means of keeping their power and economy intact. You see, the exiles, as we know them collectively, are a unique race for their ability to use what's called life-binding magics. Essentially, imagine if you could alter or mold the biomass around you. Maybe take a tree and morph it into a religious or important shape, something like that, almost like it was pottery but with living things. They could even bring aspects of the organic materials around them into themselves, taking on the nature of their environment to some extent, matching the flora and fauna. Now, back on their homeworld, life-binding magic was very sacred and was cherished, and it was part of a very beautiful display of nature and their control over it. However, here it was turned into a dark science known as Biomancy, which becomes the defining tool of the Spire. You see, rather than using life magics to form beautiful and significant works of art, Biomancy is used to create lower-class citizens based on the DNA of their ancestors. So they basically rebuilt their entire society by creating a lower caste of people that they can subjugate. It fills up the ranks, it kind of, buffs up the city and their numbers and their pool of DNA, but also lets all the important people keep being in charge and thinking that they're important. So let's say you wanted to have a team of servants. You take some of your DNA, you clone yourself, but then you go in and you alter that DNA with mutations, taking some things in, putting other things out, and then basically turning a living being into a sort of flesh, like golem. It has the tools to do whatever job it's made for, and a limit to its intelligence and ability to revolt, so it cannot question commands. And it gets worse because all of this is being done by scientists and engineers trying to get the most efficiency out of their work because they don't see these things as living creations. So this is where the society takes a really dark turn of just like, okay, we have this unique, species ability, and we're just going to turn it up to 11 in terms of science and engineering and basically make living life a product to be commanded. So I'll give you a nasty example. One of the base unit of the Spire army are called force-grown drones. These are human-sized warriors, really the chaff of the army, armed with nothing more than a spear and a shield. Well, if you have a standing army, you have to continuously feed it, clothe it, give it commands. Instead, the force-grown drones are birthed in about 2 weeks, and to cut costs, they're made with no immune system, and they have to eat this weird, recycled biomass and that kind of stuff. And you can actually get really good glimpses of this. If you look at the models, you'll notice they're all wrapped up in bindings and bandages. That's actually medical gauze full of antiseptic. They only live for a few days max, and then they die, and their biomass is recycled into the next generation. Which means they have a short, brutal life, full of war and ultimately disease, but the Spire don't care because they perceive them as property. Now, there's a lot more to cover when it goes into this stuff because, when I say that the Spires held on to the old traditions, that means Sovereign is the most powerful of these nobles, the lineages, as they call them. However, that being said, the scientists and engineers who were already on the planet did band together to form what they call the Directorate. It's basically a union of the rest of their exiles who still want to retain the ways of the old world, but they're hell-bent on going back and reclaiming their home, versus Sovereign, who's like, I'm king here, I want to be here. So even within, this one, focus or direction or reaction to the Great Betrayal, there's still, debates to be had about who's actually in charge, how do we divvy up these resources, and things like that. Now, I kind of put a pin in that because I'm running out of time on this video, and that's going to be the subject of the next one. Sovereign and the Directorate, two faces of power that really bring this faction to life. We'll also talk more about the actual way that spires, the actual towers that they live in, function and operate and obtain biomass and store it. and cover some of the units. Like I said when I did my first video, there is a ton of lore in this game, so it's going to take me a while to hammer through all of it, but I hope that you're enjoying it, and I hope that you come with me on this journey. Now, as I end all my videos, I'm going to ask the question, why is this cool? Right? I didn't cover all the information on the Spire, it's way too much for one video, but with the things that I covered, why do I think it's cool? Well, alien races in a fantasy world are awesome, and it might sound kind of strange, but they fit right in, because nothing else in this setting, to me, feels as much like the quote-unquote other, right? Something that we can't perceive as the humans in the setting are trying to, make deals with them and parlay and all this kinds of stuff. Like, they just literally don't conceive of time, space, reality, values, anything like humanity does, and that makes them a perfect version of the other. And I love the fact that they represent aspects of creation from far off. You have life binding, which is, a very beautiful religious type thing, and that's twisted into biomancy, which is just the forming of living material into whatever you want, which is just awesome. And for me, if you know me, I'm into like Lovecraftian body horror stuff, so seeing how they construct their society is really cool. The idea of saying, okay, well, we just have a few refugees and our economy dropped out. Let's just make a whole bunch of nobodies, right? And that's exactly what they did. That's how they created an economy. That's so nuts. Because even though they are the masters of this kind of life magic and this ability to mold it to their whims, they have a blatant carelessness for life itself. They treat bodies and biomass as tinker toys, tons of disposable troops. Honestly, when I started this video, I mentioned like the designers of the game really thought of this as kind of their quote-unquote elf type faction. And I'll give you, here's my synopsis, is they're elves in the sense of they're an ancient race, they are the other, they are very above, the quabbles of common man, in that same way they have all the arrogance and they're all based on their own magics and technology. Like, they are very elfy in their outlook on life. However, when it comes to their play style, they can be very, very much like what we would know from fantasy battles as the classic vampire. Tons of disposable troops, because they don't view them as troops, they just view them as pawns, unliving pieces that are not even worth their time or consideration. So it makes for a really interesting blending and warping of traditional fantasy tropes. All that matters to the Spire are their pursuit of power and resources. For some of them, they want to go back to their homeworld. Others are quite content to stay here. They don't even deign to take to the battlefields themselves. They can project their minds into like automata or avatars, and we'll get into those later on because that's a really cool story right there. But this is part one of an ongoing series on the Spire, and I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you want to learn about from them? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And I will catch you there. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and happy wargaming. Welcome back, Wargamers, to the ancient halls of the Spires as we continue our discussion of that truly horrific and fascinating race that spans the entire breadth of Ea. This is part 2 of my series on the Spires. In case you missed it, I do have a link in the description down below to part 1. Go ahead and start there and get caught up. And I want to say right before we dig in, that I do have an affiliate code to Bellum, which is the makers of Conquest, that will save you 10% in the description down below. It's all your purchases, 10% off, and it goes a long way to helping the channel. A huge thank you to everyone who's already used it. It's life-changing stuff. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So, picking up from where we left off, Sovereign came through the void, and he was the highest noble on Ea. And he sealed the gateway behind him, ensuring that no more of his race, which are now collectively known as the Exiles, can come. And this wasn't a cheap bid to be the supreme power of the Exiles, which are now, functionally, a very shattered population. Some Exiles saw this as an opportunity to restart their race without the bindings of ancient beliefs and hierarchies, and so they divided into 3 camps, 3 responses to this event. We have the Quiet, the Weavers, and the Spires. Each of them, like I said, is just a different approach to how they want to see the Exiles rebuild their broken society. The Spires, our main subject for today, were of the mind to stick to the old ways, keep to the noble lineages, and to do that they crafted a peasant race with the use of a magic called Biomancy. Now, Sovereign is the highest ranking of these lineages, as we had just said, but he just assumed that he got control of everything. right? Oh yeah, all these people who are sticking to the old way, I'm the top of their food chain. But he is pushed back and rebuffed by the other Spire leaders. Remember, the first ones here on this planet were scientists and geologists and explorers and pioneers, and while they wanted to stick to the old ways within their society, because, they're smart guys, it still leaves them on a higher rung of society, they refused to immediately abdicate all authority to Sovereign. We like the old ways, but you don't just get to come in and be supreme ruler was kind of their idea. This tension exists because they have different goals fundamentally. All of the Spires revere the old ways of their people to an extent. Noble lineages, scientists and big thinkers being of a higher class than the average citizen, but the Sovereign House has the ultimate goal of going back to their homeworld and reconquering it from whatever terrible event happened back there. So the big dog on the stage wants to leave eventually. The other leaders of the Spires have no interest in going back home. They rather bring their values, tradition, and heraldry of their old world and just restart. Have the exact same society, but now this is our home. So, when Sovereign starts acting like the big boss and giving orders, all the major scientists and researchers are like, whoa, hold the phone. We were here first, you do not directly command us. In order to have some form of representation and resistance to the will of Sovereign, the founding scientists on Ea banded together and formed one single Directorate, an organization of the best and the brightest minds of the exiles. Collectively, they're able to push back on Sovereign's authority, making their own demands, and so on. And this relationship is what forms the basis of the Spire's society as we know it in the current setting. Sovereign wants to go home, and so he pays the Directorate in biomass and other resources to research new weapons and build an army that can go home and reconquer their homeland. It's a millennia-long process that is gearing up for a massive invasion of their old homeworld. On the flip side, the Directorate, the scientists who were already here, is paid and supplied by Sovereign, allowing them to do whatever research they want, so long as they keep some resources and some research devoted to Sovereign's cause. It's a fairly symbiotic, kind of relationship or economy, I guess. Each of the heads of the Directorate is ruler of their own little domain, free to pursue any research they want, and they tithe soldiers and weapons to the cause of Sovereign, who in turn gives them all the supplies and biomass they need, awaiting the day that Sovereign goes home and the Directorate inherits Ea. At least that's how they see it. I'm sure other factions, like the Dwaghome and the 100 Kingdoms, they would all have a few words to say about the Directorate quote-unquote inheriting Ea, but that's for another day. And so that's how we have these two sub-factions of the Sovereign lineages and the Directorate, which if you go on the Bellum website, you can see kind of the lore that I got from those. But there is actually a third sub-faction within the Spires, and that is the Underspire. This is essentially the working class of the Spire society. As the power dynamic between the Sovereign lineages and this new Directorate formed, many of the higher-up scientists and thinkers found it useful to move upwards within their Spire, like literally upwards. Like if you've seen the Spire things, it's like a big tower, like literally moving up to the top floor of it. Why? Because Sovereign lived at the top, and to assert importance and be near political epicenters of their society, the Directorate, the heads of state, moved to the top of the Spire as well. And so now we have kind of this like second class divide where how high are you on the Spire can also dictate how important you are to the society. Which is a little bit backwards because the thing is, the bottom of a Spire's tower is of huge significance. Those tall towers that the Spires live in are somehow organic in nature. They have roots that dig deep into the crust of the earth, constantly harvesting natural resources and biomass that the Spires then use to create troops and that kind of thing. So with the Directorate not wanting to be down there anymore, they needed a class to control the hordes of worker drones and monitor the reclamation of resources. Now this responsibility was delegated to the lowly Pharaohmancers. Less scientific minds that can they're either barred from the use of biomancy or they just don't know how to do it. And you can also be demoted to this position, and that's kind of a constant threat that runs through all of the Directorates. If you fail too much, we'll knock you down to the level of a Pharaohmancer. It's like lower management run amok. Now, I'll go into more detail in a review of the individual units of the faction, but essentially a Pheromancer uses a complex breathing apparatus to emit pheromones to communicate with the drones at work. Remember, the clones and the drones that the Spires use have very little intelligence to them. They want them to be a dumb, almost slave race, and so this is a very primal and efficient way to communicate with them. No words, no commands. You just chemically manufactured instinct responses that have been refined to a pinpoint. Now, this arrangement has essentially made the Pheromancers and anyone else at their level second-class citizens, right? They stay in their little hole, go to the bottom of the tower and just stay there. They're not given much authority or power, and of course, they resent this. They are also exiles. They're also this people who, struck out amongst the stars and should be the inheritors of the entire planet, but they're stuck on, trash duty. So there is a discussion, as always, of rebellion. While the real seeds of such an action have not really been sowed in a huge way, at some point the higher echelon of Spire society will be reminded of just how important the Underspire is, despite how they look down upon them. And so in this way, by breaking the Spires down into their three kind of, sub-factions, big major camps, I'm sure all these guys have their own little power plays that they're working on to, steal control and authority from one another. But the truth is, the three main factions within the Spires are, of course, the sovereign lineages, people who love the old ways and want to go home. The Directorate, people who love the old ways and want to stay in control because they're the scientists and the minds who colonized Ea. And of course, the Underspire, which is just everyone that the other two groups abuse to stay on top. It paints a picture of a very bleak and savage society where power is everything, right? Being able to make decisions and wheel and deal affects thousands of lives beneath you. And so now I want to kind of transition into why is this so freaking cool. I have a few things here I want to talk about because, as you know, Spire is my army. I absolutely love it. And we're going to talk about this. So I like how the Spires represent realistic responses to problems, right? What binds them is a respect for the old ways that their culture used to have. Houses, nobility, some people were just on top, just all those kinds of things. But they can still have different goals. And that creates some wonderful drama between these immensely powerful beings with all the time in the world. For example, Sovereign jealously hoards resources and biomass much more than he lets on. Like, he is far richer in material than he lets the others know. That's why he's able to fund all this stuff. He also, fun fact, keeps the best secrets and weapons for himself, limiting the possibility of the Directorate getting too much power and overwhelming him. Now, we'll go to the specifics as we cover the lore behind each unit, but one great example that I love to point out is a unit in the Spires called the Avatara. Essentially, the actual exiles, these truly ancient beings, elf equivalents, they don't want to actually risk their own safety in battle. So they'll have a whole bunch of drones and clones go fight, but if they want to take the field, they will project their consciousness into giant constructs called Avatara. Now, for the vast amount of Spire society, Avatara are a little bit limited because you have to be kind of somewhat near them to project your mind into them. So there's a little bit of danger there. If you see an Avatara, there's a Spire guy at least somewhere nearby. Whereas Sovereign has the secret to basically project anywhere. He has so much more power and control when it comes to that unit, which is an extremely big deal when he's also in control of the largest set of lineages within the society. That's just an example, but other things like that where he's hoarding secrets of like next level tech and all this stuff like that so that the Directorate can't use it. But it's important to remember the Directorate is not immune to this either. It's a bunch of cutthroat and very exacting scientists without a hint of remorse or morality about their creations. They, amongst themselves, created a complicated web of rivals, different research projects, drone armies beneath them, and so on. It means that they are also full of drama and storytelling elements. Like, nobody's the good guy here, but they all think that the ends justify the means for them, but nobody else. Not to mention the fact that both the sovereign lineages, all the things that he does, and the Directorate, all the bad things they do, are dependent upon the Underspire, which is swelling with the discontent of exiles who got the raw end of the deal when they became part of the Spires. Like, if we kind of rewind a bit, when the exiles broke into the Quiet, the Weavers, and the Spires, you think those guys who were treated like second-class citizens were like, this is what I signed up for? It's like, no, I wish I had chosen something else. And so all of a sudden, this momentous, unstoppable house that is sovereigns' lineages and the power of the Directorate and all the armies beneath them, they feel very much like a house of cards when you realize that like the people who make those things possible hate this situation. It sets up some great narratives. We don't have rules for each subfaction yet, but I suspect they'll come out at some point. Bellum does a great job with playtesting, and so they're really taking their time, and I appreciate it. And if you didn't know, for every faction, they've created a few sub-factions within it to add a bit of depth, and I absolutely think they nailed it here. These are fantastic villains, all three of them. The Sovereign lineages, the Directorate, the Underspire, all of them have this little weird ecosystem where they have to work together, even though they all actively have different goals. Because collectively, the Spires can say, well, we follow the old ways, you know? But Sovereign represents the worst part of the old ways, right? Entitlement, greed, backed by money and resources. The Directorate, same thing, they follow the old ways, but they seek a new future, but have been bogged down with bureaucracy and really strayed away from the morality that their race had, corrupted by the dark sciences that they perform, and of course the Underspire as a largely subjugated working class acting as a powder keg for the whole system to blow. The whole thing just sets up great stories, interesting characters that need to walk a fine line being scared of people above them, but also kind of below them with the Underspire. So friends, tell me your thoughts on this below. If you were to be dropped into Spire society, which one would you want to be a part of? For me, I'm all about the Sovereign lineages. He's a dude playing the longest of long games. His household has withstood so much change, which to me is a testament to his sheer willpower and his ability to get things done. It doesn't mean he's a good guy, far from it. It just means that he is a capital G great man who can survive and change history. So I like that. I think he's a character that I always want to know more about. But I could definitely see like the Directorate being a very interesting, science form of government. I don't even know what that would be, a scienceocracy, something like that. I think it's so fascinating. But tell me your thoughts, leave in the comments down below, and I will catch you next time as we tackle the lore for another Conquest army. Tell me which army you want me to cover next. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to the fiery core of Aya, because today we are talking about the Dwaghome of Conquest, the last argument of kings. And for those of you who are new to Conquest, this is Bellum, the game company who makes this, their take on the classic trope of dwarves. They stand a head and shoulders shorter than the average human, are physically strong and stout, and they make their home deep in mined cities beneath the mountains. And that's pretty much where the similarities end, because there is so much more going on, and their story really begins long before their true birth on Aya. Just roll with me here. As I discussed in my brief history of the setting, which you can find in this same playlist, there was a point in time where the Spires were at war with the dragons, these truly ancient creatures, some of the firstborn of the universe who had taken physical form. Well, that war did not go well for the Spires, a race that at the time was still actively trying to recover from the loss of its homeworld. And this presented to the dragons a very unique opportunity to bargain. And so I want to pause here to talk about the dragons, and I promise this is super relevant to the Dwaghome. Essentially, there are two forms of dragons. There's elders, the most ancient of their kind that retain incredible power. They would be as gods to any normal man. And the younger generations, who found that after each successive generation of breeding and having children, that kind of stuff, dragons began to lose a measure of their cosmic power. And so as their species proliferated, they became weaker, more corporeal. And these younger generations were jealous that anything they could do, the elders could do better. Right? They were just so good at everything. But the younger dragons did have some advantages. They needed less time to rest, where ancients needed centuries to sleep in between bouts of being active. And they have a greater eye for detail and a firmer grasp on reality. They're a little more sharp. And the reason all of that matters is that as the war with the Spires was ending, these younger generations began to understand the basic idea of biomancy. Not a true knowledge of it, but kind of a general concept. And they wanted it bad. Now, if you didn't watch my series on the Spire, biomancy is essentially magic that allows you to manipulate and change and morph living things. And it's always kind of referred to with this sort of like gross or dark negative connotation, almost like flesh crafting or something like that, where there's a horror element to it. Their opportunity came when the exiles had their internal split, which we covered in the Spire lore. The remnants of this alien race split into 3 factions that we know today: the Quiet, the Weavers, and the Spire. Now, there's a bit more that I don't want to go too far into the weeds on, but essentially the dragons signed a peace treaty with the sovereign houses of the Spires, and part of that surrender was giving the dragons the gift of biomancy. And that was when it was first introduced into dragon society. For an incredibly long time, they toiled over their creations, first making rudimentary life, and then more complex systems. And in just a few centuries, basic sapient life had begun. They were essentially designing a people that would be created to serve and worship the dragons, to keep them safe during their long rests, to collect precious resources and treasures for them, to build grandiose roosts, or dragon holds if you want to call it that, for their masters as a display of wealth and mastery over magic. 'Cause again, these are dragons, they're like trying to show off to one another who's supreme, and so whoever has the best, ability to wield biomancy to create the best race to serve them is the top dog. However, they didn't just need to make a people, just to create life. They needed to create a culture. It had to be self-sustaining when they left, and understand art and craftsmanship to fulfill their purpose. They had to be intelligent, of course, able to function together as a society while the dragons rested, completely self-sufficient. And a decision was made in their kind of designing of these servants that was very interesting. See, rather than having each generation train the next, which slows down progress because, your kids don't know much at all, a portion of your servants' lives are spent not serving their whim, not knowing how to build these incredible artifacts or whatever, the gift of memory was added. Now, when I say memory, I mean like capital M memory. It's different than like you just remembering something. This is essentially a built-in record-keeping system. It's almost like racial knowledge. You're born just knowing stuff. Now, we're not quite clear on how complex this is, but it would be stuff like you have a basic understanding of masonry, a basic understanding of metallurgy, and so this way you can get up to speed very, very quickly as you are aging, making you a better servant for the dragon, and therefore like a more accomplished part of the race that they're trying to build. And finally, the fully sentient race of humanoids were formed, and they were known as the Crafters. And the dragons even had a little pet name for them as well. They called them dwarves, for they are dwarves before their creator's might. So in a way, it's sort of like a jabbing derogatory term, just kind of to remind you that you are put in your place. But crafters is the name of the species. And while some dragons treated their servants with respect, almost like pets, others were true tyrants and overlords, seeing their lives as absolutely devoid of value. And for an extremely long time, this went on. Like, the race proliferated. Since dragons were everywhere, so too were this new race of crafters, or dwarves, expanding and building and securing treasure, and the wealth and the roosts for their lords. They were just everywhere. But there's a flaw in this great plan, and like most things, it began with a shortcut. The dragons did build in loyalty. The dwarves felt fear and horror at disobeying their masters above them. But they did also give them that capital M memory as a shortcut, so they wouldn't have to teach successive generations, skills and stuff. But the problem is, now as a species, they remember acts of aggression, of tyranny, shows of dominance, and reminders that they are, in fact, no matter how nice the dragons are, a slave race. All of that is inside every one of the crafters' heads when they're born. Now, there were signs of resistance, but nothing that couldn't be shut down very swiftly. They couldn't really organize, and if they did, it was nowhere near the power they needed to claim their freedom. So the dwarves just kept their heads down and kept digging and working just like they were created to do for centuries. They dug and built and toiled until they dug a bit too deep. Now, in the first video I did about the setting, I had mentioned this idea of primordial gods, that just like in other popular games, there are gods that represent concepts like famine, temptation, war, and so on. But what I didn't mention was that in the creation of Ea, the actual planet that this whole takes place on, one very specific primordial god was bound and imprisoned deep in the crust of the earth. Its name was War. Now I'm going to pause here and throw out a very fun fact that sounds irrelevant until I bring it back around. Let's talk about magical feedback, okay? In the setting of Conquest, when a spell is undone, or like unbound, I guess we could kind of use that term, basically it creates a feedback that hurts the caster. If you disrupt someone's, I don't know, lightning bolt spell or whatever like that, it hurts the person that was trying to channel it into lightning. And the reason that matters is because there is no greater spell than the prison that kept War, that primordial god, silent and locked away. And it took many, many decades, but eventually a plan was set in motion that would see the crafters free of their dragon lords. War is a spirit of fire and earth, and freeing him from his prison is an epic event known as the Shattering. The feedback, again, that magical feedback I just talked about, of this kind of level of event, straight up insta-killed many of the eldest dragons. And those crafters who initially freed War were sort of blessed by him. And with this blessing of now being free of some of their overlords, having gotten the blessing of a new god and forging their own path, this new sect of crafters dubbed themselves the Dwaghome. And the murder spree did not end there. Now that some of the eldest dragons were taken down, the lesser ones needed to be hunted. Some were killed in their sleep, others were crushed with crude artillery. And it's important to note here that this is also not only, dwarves versus dragons, it's also a civil war like on a species level. Because remember, the crafters are the race. Some of them are dwarves who still serve the dragons, some of them are Dwaghome. So some of these want, freedom from the tyranny of the dragons, but dwarves still exist at this point. And so the decision was made that either the crafters would be free or they would die. So dwarves were hunted with the same ferocity as their dragon overlords. So we have the Dwaghome, who are, racially speaking, they are dwarves. They are crafters, that core race, but they refuse to let any of their own kind serve the dragons. Remember, if a dragon is sleeping, the idea is that they have this whole race of dwarves to basically defend it. So it's like, if we have to get to that dragon, I will march over you to do so. So in this way, we have a race that is utterly divided upon their values and things like that. Some are still following the dragons, others are trying to free themselves of the shackles, and they are both utterly uncompromising towards the other. And keep in mind, all of this takes an extremely long time. We're talking centuries here. Big stretches of land to journey from one place to another. You have populations have to boom and kind of reconstitute numbers. But the Dwaghome were making real progress of freeing their race from the clutches of the dragons. And as they're doing so, problems began to kind of pop up pretty quickly, because a flaw in their creation began to rear its ugly head when it came to things like leadership. The oldest crafters of this race were dwarves, meaning they still served the dragons. Whereas the Dwaghome, free of those shackles of who created them when and who is supposed to be in charge, don't have the ancient lineages and authority structures that were handed down by the dragons, and so this problem developed. And what began there was an event called the Memory Wars, because bereft of true unified leadership, the Dwaghome are using their, again, capital M, memory, to be like, okay, so I should be in charge based on these things. Well, okay, if your memory, capital M again, does not match up with everybody else's, who also has their own version of reality and history and achievements and that kind of thing, you're going to have problems. All of a sudden, peoples, because of their perspective, because they were a part of different roosts or served different dragons, their perception of who should be in charge, what's rightful authority, that kind of thing, it all is different. And I can't emphasize enough, memory is so important to this race. So when different holds or rooks had different recollections of authority, who should be in charge, how to conduct themselves, it is a kind of tension that can't be resolved with discussion. It's built into their brain and their blood. It goes so much deeper than a disagreement. So deep that the fledgling Dwaghome race had its own civil wars amongst itself. And honestly, that kind of feeds directly into where they stand now. This revolution happened centuries ago in the current timeline, and things have settled down a bit. The Dwaghome have formed simple clans or based their society on lineage and homeland, but they are all fiercely independent and warlike. I cannot, again, oversell the aggressive nature of the Dwaghome. It's what they know, it's what they remember, it's what gave them freedom, and it's their greatest strength. And there's certainly more to talk about with the Dwaghome, as all armies have these little sub-factions that really bring it to life by showing you different perspectives on the same history. And we're going to cover all of those in my next Conquest lore video, because they collectively put a lot of pieces to the puzzle together. But let's end this video talking about why is this cool. For me, origins are everything, right? I love the fact that they were designed with care. Like, they had to create the physical forms of the actual crafters themselves, and then create a society that would serve the needs of the dragons, kind of a thing. It seems a lot more personal than like the manufacturing factory-like nature of the Spires using Biomancy. But regardless of how, like, you know, streamlined it is, it's all artificial. Their art, their history, their values, all of it was manufactured by the dragons, which is such a weird mind bend. Then there's this whole idea of the shattering, which is literally bringing a god to a dragon fight, which is the coolest, you know, battle that I've ever heard of. And the whole idea of the Dwaghome as an army that you and I can play in this game comes from a point of desiring freedom, desiring revolution. That's just a unique take that I hadn't seen a lot, specifically when it comes to dwarves. Usually they're an ancient race that's, you know, very focused, very loyal, very like predictable almost in how they'll react to various things, but this is utterly different. And part of that fact is that their strength is also their weakness, and I love that that's what makes them sort of this great counterpoint to so many traditional fantasy tropes. Their capital M memory let them build to independence. It saw them digging deeper, constructing bigger, making better weapons, better holds, more treasure, all these wonderful things. First of all, fulfilling the needs of the dragons, but then, you know, once the dragons are unseated from their power, it's still helping them as a race to proliferate and spread and all these things. However, it has also utterly and completely divided them from one another. When core memories like that don't line up, it's just not something that they can resolve. It's not a disagreement, it's a conflict in their reality, and they cannot like let that go. And the duality of that blessing and curse makes them so interesting to me. Because you can have, you know, in this way, if you wanted to have like freedom to write whatever kinds of characters or, you know, leader you wanted for your hold or your roost, you really do have a lot of freedom, because you can just say like, well, this is his perception of reality. I mean, and that's it. Anything else is anathema to him. And it's exactly how it is. And it's so interesting to see them use what they know in terms of like weapons, armor. All of it looks so incredibly cool. Craftsmanship is a real theme throughout the model line as well. These models are fantastic looking. And it makes sense, as craftsmanship was important to their creators. They were built to serve. And that just got carried over when they became an independent race. So for all these reasons, I think the Dwaghome are quite possibly one of the most interesting armies in this game, but certainly I think the most interesting take on classic dwarves. But I would love to hear your thoughts. Go ahead and leave the comments down below. And hey, if you're thinking about grabbing some Dwaghome stuff, if you wouldn't mind, consider using my affiliate link in the description down below. It goes a long way to helping support me and my family, as well as continue making content like this. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming. Welcome, wargamers, to the deep holds of Ea. because today we are talking about the Dwaghome yet again, specifically touching on their sub-factions. Now, if you missed part 1, you're going to want to see that to kind of set up a lot of the preface for what we're talking about here. I left the link to that video in the description down below, and while you're down there, if you're looking to save 10% on all your purchases from Bellum, I have an affiliate link down there. It does go to help to support the channel. It would mean the world to me if you would use it. But as a very fast recap to the last episode, the Dragons of Ea history created a subservient race of slaves known as the Crafters. These are what we generally know as dwarves. Well, some of these crafters used their genetic memory to overcome their built-in servitude and overthrow their oppressors. And these warlike and aggressive versions of crafters dubbed themselves the Dwaghome. Now, once they attained their freedom, they went on an absolute killing spree, hunting dragons and killing any dwarves who chose to stay loyal to their masters, but ultimately this just presented another problem. The Dwaghome had no long lineages or method of governance that wasn't dragon installed, and the same genetic memory that led to their freedom also very much divided them as a race. And at that moment where the will and the shackles of the dragons were cast off, where the primordial god, known as war, was unleashed, that whole event was known as the shattering. And that moment is instilled deeply in every single Dwaghome. And even though the Dwaghome as a people have near perfect memory, they are still limited by individual perspectives. Now, obviously, if you have multiple perspectives of a single event, you can reach very, very different conclusions. And so today, that's what we're going to talk about. The 3 Dwaghome sub-factions that are really based on the perspective of how this group views the events of the shattering. Essentially asking, what did that event mean for me and my people's identity? And this has largely fallen into 3 different categories: the clans, the Ardent, and the Tempered. All of these are equally Dwaghome. They may unite, they might try to kill one another, but they are nonetheless branches of the same tree. So we'll kick it off with the clans because they are the most numerous race. They make up the vast bulk of the Dwaghome as a people. Bereft of their dragon overlords and taskmasters, the everyday rank-and-file Dwaghome have formed a fascinating little type of society. Essentially, they now view labor as punishment, or at a minimum, the work of like a peasant or a slave. Which, given their backstory, makes absolute sense. So in an effort to basically get out of that work, they're constantly trying to display their own worth or importance. The word for this in Conquest is Dwaghome. It's sort of a way of defining an individual's weight both in terms of social importance and their status, and their achievements and accolades. Important Dwaghome rise to the top and are given more prestigious, positions of power and better weapons, and they have to do less and less menial work, again moving away from that slave mentality, while the others remain in their lowly positions until they have achieved greatness or die on the battlefield. Now, honestly, this is not a super revolutionary concept, right? Hard workers and fighters go up their ranks. It's basically a meritocracy, pure and simple. From the lowly miner to the most prestigious high elder of a clan. However, there's a catch that makes this a bit unique, and that is their memories. That near-perfect memory makes a meritocracy look a bit different, right? When there are centuries-long, perfectly kept records of you and your family's deeds that are always in an active bid for social and military currency, this is not a matter of pride and vanity. This is like very much a measure of worth and your deeds to society, rather than perceived merit. And because memory is so important, it's studied very deeply. It has been refined and turned into an actual discipline, and is a power known as Biomancy. It's a magic that can bind and judge a group of Dwaghome together, and as such, Biomancers, those who wield the power of memory almost as an arcane art, are often seen as the leaders of the common folk. They're the ones who truly understand this kind of network that they've all created with one another. Now, what's troubling about this is that the origins of these societies are so deeply rooted in warfare and conquest that those tend to be the easiest and most numerous ways to gain Dwaghome. So when you put all these pieces together, you have a rather heartless military meritocracy, where everyone at every tier is looking for ways to prove themselves on the battlefield, to rise in rank, have others work for them. They become a somewhat faceless military machine, but it's interesting because they still have individuality, like everybody has an individual merit. But that only means anything if your merit reaches a certain threshold, if you have enough Dwaghome to be of note. So when they go to war, every soldier knows they will fight as hard as they can to gain a piece of something greater. And so that is the lore behind the clans. Now there are two more, and they're much smaller groups within Dwaghome society. And these have a lot more to do with like the future of the race, who they are, how they're divided, that kind of thing. So we'll jump in with the Ardent. To put their perspective in a brief way, they see the birth of their race, the Dwaghome, not at the time of the shattering, but long before that when the first dwarf tried to refuse to bow to his dragon master, but was forced to. We know that before the actual events of the shattering, some Dwaghome, because of their genetic memory, were trying very hard to rebel against dragons, but there was never much of a resistance because they were just so scattered. So these are Dwaghome who see the fires and the spirit of rebellion as the true nature of their race, right? Like, this is what makes a real Dwaghome, is that will to never be shackled or bow. Which, like I said, started long before the events of the shattering, but was significantly amplified by it. So these are a very warlike sect who want to keep that fire within them burning. That rage and power, first unleashed by breaking War from his prison, was their gateway to freedom. And so it should be embraced as the purest form of the Dwaghome race. They will often have their holds dig deep, deep, deep into the earth, near the old prison of where War was contained, and where the beast known as Destruction lingers. Here, foul, mutated creatures make their homes. It twists and corrupts things into these nasty monsters, and for the Ardent, this is a test. A trial to see if you can stand before the fires of destruction and war like your ancestors did during the shattering. Are you strong enough to handle it? Because only if you can you truly claim to be Dwaghome. And basically, to do this task, you have to go down to the deepest parts of Ea to feel the primordial powers flow into you and fight off monsters that it created. And this event imbues these chosen with an intensity for war that few can match. This is where you'll see a lot of, I believe, flame berserkers and such overcome by this hum of war. And so, bringing that more into a kind of simplified worldview, the Ardents are a faction that deeply revere their ancestors in terms of like their actions and the spirit of what they were going for. Those who resisted the dragons before there was ever even a hope of freedom. But they also revel in the untold power that their ancestors tapped into. It's made them have like a near like war fever. But these are ultimately a people defined by the past and the Dwaghome who stood before war and lived through it. And the last group today is the Tempered, and as their name suggests, there are some cooler heads here amongst the Dwaghome as well, or at least sharper, though they still make up a relatively small part of Dwaghome society. And essentially their perspective is less about the past per se, like the Ardent, and more about the future. Right? No matter how we got here, right? Creation by dragons, the shattering, like no matter how you define what Dwaghome is now, we are here now, and we as a race need to decide where we're going. In their minds, during the events of the shattering, the intent of their forefathers was to channel the power of war to gain freedom, but ultimately not to set him loose. However, these older Dwaghome, the ones who did the shattering, got greedy and sapped too much power from the prison, ultimately leading to the events of the shattering. So they're saying unleashing war was kind of a mistake. Now, that's not inherently a bad thing. I mean, they do have their freedom. The goal was ultimately achieved, but the Tempered see the works of those first Dwaghome as very short-sighted, that they were all wrapped up with this desire for war and freedom and vengeance, that they went just a little too far. So in response, the Tempered seek to change the course of the Dwaghome species, giving themselves wholly and completely to war like the Ardent want to do is an absolute recipe for disaster. It won't let us enjoy the freedom that we actually got into this mess in the first place for. And again, they look to the Ardent as great evidence of this, right? Infused directly with dark powers of primordial gods, they go out and they search for war to the point of self-destruction. And the Tempered see the way forward in revering the past, but attempting to change the course that has been set by their race. To understand the power the Dwaghome have tapped into and study where it leads, but always keep it in check. And because of this, the Tempered have become the most preeminent mages and scholars in Dwaghome society, often called metal mages, cue the guitar riff. They have perfected the mastery over the Dwaghome environment and contributed to its development with arcane and engineering masterpieces. So as I do with all these videos, let's take a step back and talk about why is this so freaking cool, these three perspectives and reactions to something. I like the shattering as a narrative, hook or tool, because it's a singular event in their history that's defined this race in several ways. The clans just want to go on with their life, right? Making so they don't ever become a slave again. It's good, but it's very short-sighted. It's very in the moment. There's not really much of a future to that society other than we have to keep fighting stuff. They're not trying to think about the future. They're not trying to do nation building. Then you have the Ardent, who view the shattering as an almost mythological and religious moment, right? Something to be reenacted, a tone and worldview to be carried on, born in fire, going out and fighting everything and everyone. And then you have the Tempered, who are none of our history matters if our race gets ourselves killed by fighting everybody at once. And so these are three totally legit responses that you would see. Now, we do know the next edition of Conquest is somewhere around the corner, and that these subfactions will each be getting flavorful rules so that you can enjoy them in that way. So this is the perfect time to really think about the events of the shattering, decide how you feel about it, and join one of those three perspectives on it. Each subfaction highlights an aspect of Dwaghome society, but isn't dominated by it. So you can have a hold that has basically all the dudes you want to have in there. Go nuts. Don't feel like these have to be three, totally different camps. They can kind of blend together a little bit. Because remember, whoever the rake or the king is for your hold, he'll determine the standing of all of them. So there's still tons of room to create your own narrative and what your hold looks like and how its little ecosystem functions between these three huge power groups. So let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. What faction do you want to learn about next? I'm hoping to cover all of the factions in general before I go backwards, and then I'm going to start talking about the individual units. I think that would be pretty fair. So everyone gets kind of a taster of what the faction is, and then we'll go on to more specific things from there. But thank you so much for watching and listening to this video. If you wouldn't mind sharing it to someone who might be interested in Conquest, it would mean the world to me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to the icy wastes of Ea, because today we are talking about the Nords, one of the coolest factions to exist in Conquest, the Last Argument of Kings, and some of the most beautiful models that you will see by Bellum. Now, before we go too far, I just want to say I do have an affiliate code with them to save you some money when you go ahead on to the Bellum web store. And I want to give a huge thank you to those who have already used it, because it goes a huge way to supporting this channel and my wife and I. Now, for those of you who are new to Conquest, or at least the faction you're interested in, Nords, these are the barbarian hordes of humans that live in the far north, surviving this deadly environment by brute force, cunning, and a largely nomadic lifestyle. Now, I will be honest, many fantasy properties have this kind of army theme in some form, right? Vikings that come from the icy lands to pillage and claim glory. But there is so much more going on here. I cannot possibly oversell this, because when you talk about the Nords as a faction and as a people, there's essentially two stories being told simultaneously. There's the history according to the Nords, passed down through their very rich oral traditions. They have this entire mythology that uses kind of Nord-based themes that we've seen before, like Odin and Loki and the Ragnarok and all these kinds of things. That's how they interpret the events that have happened to them. On the other hand, you have other races who have history logs, archaeological evidence, research, and they look at the Nord people and have pieced together the history. So again, there's what the Nords believe, and then there's like what actually happened to them. And that's actually how I want to break up this episode. So we're going to start it off with talking about the Nords mythology, what they perceive to be the events of their people and the world, and then we're going to talk about the actual truth, because it's insanely cool. So let's get into the history according to the Nords, their mythology, their beliefs. Well, essentially it starts off with a bunch of people existed in the north. So it's not a very deep understanding of the, I guess, beginning of mankind. But humans did exist, and they stretched out far and wide. They existed and migrated north, which is, generally speaking, a rather cold and unforgiving place. In this area, they were originally ruled over by a race of giants. Now, there's not really a confirmed word as to whether or not these are related at all to the Jotnar, which are sort of giants that they can actually take as units in the game, or if it was something else. But they were essentially under the thumb of these giants. And then the giants got pushed away because the dragons came. And it's like, okay, so they essentially just traded one set of management for another because the dragons were, as we mentioned in the Spire video and that kind of stuff, not great. They were really, really not good. And they were only freed from this tyrannical rule of the dragons when two kingdoms of the gods arrived. To them, the skies opened up and, these two hosts of the celestial realm descended upon them and freed them from the control of the dragons. They articulated these two kingdoms as the Aesir and the Vanir. So at this point in their mythology, the gods have descended and vanquished their ruler of the dragons, and some of the names of the gods in this pantheon are things that we know. Odin, Loki, those kinds of things that we can recognize very easily. And with the dragons gone, the gods established their home called Yggdrasil, which was a massive tree planted in this icy wasteland that rose up towards the heavens. And essentially, in the context of their mythology, this is like their Mount Olympus, the home of the gods. And surrounding the tree was what would become the Nord race. And from here, the gods gave man, or the Nord specifically, art and culture and weapon crafting and all these great things that really helped them build a society. It was good to be in their presence. However, these gods also warned of a coming war, a threat that would require the best and brightest fighters from amongst the Nords. And so, Odin, standing in front of all his people and his subjects, decreed that when the best and brightest of the Nords is about to die, meaning they suffered some terrible injury or were kind of waning in years, they would be taken to Valhalla, where they would kind of train and prepare for the upcoming, end times battle known as the Ragnarok. So, for some period of time, every single time, one of the best of their society would fall, all of a sudden the gods would descend, scoop them up, and take them to Valhalla, where they would be basically training and sleeping and resting until they were needed to be unleashed upon the enemy. There weren't a lot of details about who was coming to fight them, but that there was going to be some big mega battle at the end of the world. Now, it fell to a being known as Heimdallr to wake these warriors up when that day came. Essentially, when the army that was supposed to come and bring a Ragnarok with it marched upon the lands of Yggdrasil, the giant tree, it was this dude, Heimdallr's job, to wake up all of the warriors who were training in Valhalla and bring them onto the battle. But that event did not happen. As it turns out, one of the other gods, Loki, the trickster, slew Heimdallr before he could wake up these sleeping warriors. And so this is where things go south. See, Loki preventing these super soldiers, these warriors of renown who were training and sleeping and resting in Valhalla, because they weren't around, the Ragnarok happened. Okay, the enemy came, again, we're not going to go into too much detail about who they were, and they burned Yggdrasil, the giant tree, the home of the gods. The gods themselves, of course, they went to battle, right? They didn't have their super soldiers that they wanted to have with them, but they did the best that they could. And in that battle, this Ragnarok event, both the Aesir and the Vanir were struck down. They were absolutely shattered. Their fortifications were destroyed. The Nordic people were almost obliterated. They just kind of shattered out from there into small tribes, as we would know them now as the Nords. Their gods were dead, and the Ragnarok had passed. All while the soldiers that were collected to fight that battle kept sleeping. Now, the army that came and fought the battle of Ragnarok, they left as well, now that the gods were all dead and the Nordic people were shattered into 1,000 little fragments. And in that vacuum of power, the giants came back. And this next event, the kind of next chapter in Nord history, is called the Fimbulwinter, where the Jotnar took control again. Again, they were like thousands of years ago, they were in charge in the first place. So now we have the Nords under the yoke again of a subjugating force. And it's at this time that some of those soldiers that were taken to Valhalla, known as the Einhari, woke up. And when they came out of whatever cove or place that they were, and showed themselves to the Nords again for the first time. Remember, these are heroes that they knew that were taken to Valhalla. When they showed up here at this point in time, just randomly waking up, people were absolutely baffled because they had grown in incredible stature and size. They looked like living gods and war machines themselves. They were such titans that they went toe-to-toe with the giants that were around them and pushed them back into the mountains. So now we have a situation where the Nords have their heroes back to them, and they are strong enough for them, collectively, the Nord society, to keep itself safe. We don't need Aesir and Vanir. We have these warriors that they created. Now, only a couple of these Einhari woke up. Many were taken, but just a few of them woke up on their own. Many of them became the leaders of Nord clans, which makes sense. I mean, they're the biggest, the strongest, and they are the ones who are capable of pushing away any threats. But some flaws started to kind of pop up in some of them. Some of them went kind of wild or crazy. Others went like truly feral and became monsters. And others just kind of walked away. It's like their minds just couldn't handle their new forms or something like that. And they just kind of like checked out. But what is known is that there are still many of these warriors, the ones who were taken to Valhalla, the Einhari, that are still slumbering to this day, although not really sure where they are. But they exist, and they're resting up for a war that they already missed. Okay, so we're going to pause right there. That is their oral tradition, okay? The gods came and freed us. They took a bunch of our best and brightest and said that they're going to train and then ultimately rest for when Ragnarok comes, and that event didn't happen. Ragnarok did. Everything to them fell apart and was shattered, and now just some stragglers from those who were taken are popping up. And so with that being said, we're going to dive into the actual history. Okay, it does start kind of the same way of just people just randomly went north into a cold and unforgiving place. They were initially ruled by giants, then dragons came, of course, and they were only freed, according to their tradition, by the two kingdoms of the gods, the Aesir and the Vanir. And this is where things depart, right? The stories really split. There's a mountain of evidence that these factions, these kingdoms of gods, Aesir and Vanir, were in fact representatives of the Spires and the Weavers. Two factions that are we explored a little bit of during the Spire week. And these are two factions of the Exiles, an alien race that came to Earth. And using their twin arts of Biomancy and life binding, they built that massive tree city that was their home. And hey, they even have a little population below them that they can kind of use for menial tasks and, in exchange for some information. Hey, they think that we're gods. That's funny. We'll just kind of use that to our advantage. We'll just kind of play with them like they were pets, basically. They look down on the Nords. However, all the stuff with the Spire and the Weavers, they were arrogant, but they were certainly not dumb. And if you're looking at the kind of global timeline of the events of Conquest as a whole, they saw what was going on in the Old Dominion, which we haven't covered in detail quite yet, but I promise I will. And we're like, oh no, we need to get ready for this. If you want to know more about the chronology of events, you can go check out my video just called Welcome to Ea. I just kind of walk through this timeline just to kind of get you caught up. But essentially, the major settlements of mankind were getting really dark and twisted. And so the Spires and the Weavers here in the far icy north saw that and were like, you know what, we should have a backup plan in case things really go south and they walk on us. Which honestly makes a great deal of sense. They're forward thinkers. That's how they got to where they are. And so they decided to make an army with the local biological stock, the Nords. And this is where we get into some real dark, weird stuff, because they took the nearly dead Nords to quote-unquote Valhalla, which in truth was most likely like a research wing or department. There, using the biomancy and life magics and stuff, they were turned into true demigods, superhumans. I mean, they're like 8 feet tall. They can go toe-to-toe with the biggest elephants and all, just crazy stuff. Because they needed super soldiers to die on their behalf when the Old Dominion walks up. And the idea was, hey, if things go south with the Old Dominion, we have this army. It's just sitting there sleeping for us. And hey, if they never come, I'm not worried about it. We just let them there and let them sit in stasis. But unfortunately, this army was never awoken because a schism erupted between the Spires and the Weavers. Now, we saw the Nords' perception of that drama as Loki sabotaging everything, but whatever the reason, the super soldiers that were meant to defend the Spires and the Weavers was never woken up. And so, these soldiers slept while the empire that created them was functionally annihilated. Whatever garrison the exiles, which is the collective term for Spires and Weavers, whatever, garrison they had was utterly destroyed. I'm sure that they spent a lot of physical resources to try and protect their kingdom. They lost it all, and ultimately, they just didn't see it as sustainable, so they left. And so in the mind of the Nords, their gods were dead. Ragnarok had come and passed by, which now we know is the Old Dominion just savagely tearing across all of Ea. And with no defenders, the giants move back in until these soldiers randomly begin waking up from their stasis and are reintegrating back into Nord society. Now those are the two stories, and there's a few other notes you want to touch on about what makes them so cool before we end the video. And one of those things is that the Nords have a rich narrative, tradition, and tribal culture. Right? The reason that they can't be convinced otherwise that no, the gods didn't come to you. It was actually, you were just being manipulated on a level that you cannot comprehend. And part of the reason for that is they are led by these warriors who lived through the promises of the gods and their legends. It's not ignorance. It all fits into their worldview. Right? If the giant, 8 to 9 foot tall super soldier right there in front of you is saying, I was taken by the gods and transformed into this, and I now have the power to defend you and those around me. If he says that story is true, who are you to argue with him? Right? He is the evidence of that story. And as a people, they value strength and survival and feats of conquest and honor. They're not evil. It's not about dark gods or anything. They've just crafted this warrior culture that was taken advantage of by a more sophisticated society and basically used as an elaborate meat shield. Which is a hard thing to rationalize, so it's actually easier to believe all this stuff about the gods because, again, the giant man in front of you who's defending you believes it. And truly, that's the tragedy, right? They live in their own post-apocalypse. Even though everybody else's lives are going on as normal, the story that they were fed of the gods and Valhalla and Ragnarok, it was all a lie, if not a half-truth. And that lie is a central tenet of their faith, their culture, their value system, and it's constantly reinforced by the fact that someone who lived it is standing right there. But again, the story has ended. Ragnarok happened. So, like, they're just kind of this drifting race that is unsure of the direction that they should go. And so I want to end this video like I do with all of mine, just talking really briefly about why this is so cool to me. And to be honest, right here in my notes, the first thing I have is, are you kidding me? Like, Vikings that underwent alien manipulation to become super soldiers and now live in a post-apocalyptic frozen hellscape. Like, I can't hear you over the sick metal guitar riffs that are playing in my head right now. It is the coolest thing ever. Like, if that sales pitch is not enough to hook you on the Nords as a faction, I can't do anything else, right? No amount of discount affiliate codes is going to make you excited as that statement should be. To complement those things, and kind of show that they are now more in control and more self-sustaining now that their heroes are returned to them, they use all manner of cool creatures that they can bring into battle and kind of shepherd now that they have real might to exert on their environment, which is really cool. And their model range is absolutely stunning. I really do recommend, no matter what game system you play, go ahead and check them out. Honestly, they're really great models. Now, in my next video on the Nords, we're going to talk about the Subfactions, and that is essentially looking at how this history forms a very distinctive people group and value set, because even though there is the Nords, capital N Nords as a kind of race, smaller tribes are kind of the norm for their culture. And so that means multiple perspectives on how these stories are told and how they're received, what evidence there is for them, how they build that mythos into their lives, and how other factions look at them, interpreting that mythos with a lot of horror, and rightfully so. And so, friends, I want to thank you so much for watching and listening to this video here with me. I hope that I have at least interested you in this faction, because they are one of the coolest out there and most original, where, on the surface, it's very vanilla, Nordic kind of history, Viking culture, that kind of stuff. But the second you peel that first layer off, you're like, oh, there's a lot in here. And I will be honest, it was a bit hard to discuss simply because, like with so many other things in Conquest, all of the factions are deeply intertwined into each other's history. So it was a little bit hard to talk about, the introduction of the Spires and how they did all this stuff. And then the dragons were there. Well, the dragons are a huge part of every single race's history. And so it's just a lot of interweaving of stories. So I hope I did a good job. I hope you understand how cool this is. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below, and I'll do my best to clarify it for you. But thank you so much, and I will catch you next time. Happy wargaming. Welcome, wargamers, to the icy norths of Ea. Today we're talking again about the Nords. Now, if you missed my part 1 on this faction, you really should go back and check it out. It kind of sets up a lot of the information, but a brief synopsis if you just need a refresher. The Nords are a group of humans that reside in the far frozen north of the setting, and they make their lives happen by hard work and determination and raiding other civilizations. At some point, they were visited by the Exiles, a race of aliens from another planet, whom the Nords interpreted as gods from their mythos walking among them. These gods were in fact early bits of the Spires and the Weavers, which are two very well established factions on Ea working in tandem, to naturally use occurring wildlife of the tundras, meaning the humans there, the Nords, as a defensive weapon against a greater threat. Many Nord heroes were taken and turned into super weapons, living towers of flesh that could take on an army. But these weapons were never unleashed, and so they slept for many centuries. They missed the epic battle they were made for, known as Ragnarok, and have woken up later, finding the pantheon of gods that put them there gone and shattered. And what became of this fractured race are the Nords we know today. Now, that being said, there's still more going on, because a history like that cannot happen without drastically affecting people. Now, typically when we discuss subfactions and Conquest, it always breaks down into 3 groups that often form because of different responses to the core of the lore at hand. right? So in the Spires video, there's 3 subfactions that reflect a direct response to a sovereign making certain decisions. But it's a bit different for the Nords because they aren't so much divided by their opinions of the past, but by their actual genetic makeup. This is a race of people that has been poked and prodded, a collection of science experiments that were never seen to fruition and were ultimately discarded by a higher scientific mind of a race. And so today we're going to explore these different stratas of Nord culture and life, but I want to hammer home one thing really quickly at the start here. These are all Nords, right? No matter how mundane or, I guess, esoteric a unit might be, and all the points in between, they're all Nords. They see each other as branches of the same tree, they work together, they survive together, they win together. Yes, occasionally various tribes will fight over the scarce resources in the north, and yes, they may occasionally form warbands that have all kinds of mixtures of different types of, heroes and monsters that go along with them, but they're all Nords. If a camp led by a warlord has a pack of ogre with him, and a group of normal humans, they're both held in the same esteem. Because life is not cheap to the Nords, because it's so hard to get humans to grow to maturity in such a hostile environment. So while these subfactions may seem like they would be at odds with each other sometimes, think of them more like a scientist approaching this and making species and subspecies, like just different categories of the same core concept, that is, of course, Nords. Some are human stock, others bear the scars of the genetic meddling of the Spires, while others are the direct subjects that survived Ragnarok. But they're all one faction with a complex mythology and history weaving them together. Now the first subfaction I want to talk about are the mortals. These are the humans that make up the vast majority of the faction. But as we get into the more strange and distinct type of Nords, do not fall for the trap of thinking that these mortals are somehow less than. Each Nord is tough, they're a rugged survivor, and they can make their way in 2 possible professions. There's farming and raiding. If they farm, they use their strength to try and yield any crops possible from the relentless environment. Whereas raiding has many more dangers associated with it, but also has the most potential for upward mobility. A single good raid can keep a Nord wealthy enough to eat and live for years. A few good raids could see a Nord inducted into higher tiers of leadership and society. And when your average citizen starts as a warrior who has to kill, hunt, and claim glory regularly, you can expect a normal Nord human to put up a pretty good fight. These are scary dudes and ladies. Next up are the halfbloods. And so this is where the long-lasting ramifications of the Spires and the Weavers' interference really start to matter. Because they created a set of super soldiers called the Einhari, but they were not really meant to live past their big battle, Ragnarok. Never mind, keep going and start to breed. But they did. And the genetic manipulations that were done to them were sort of carried on to their progeny, and I strongly emphasize the term sort of. The original Einhari were like humans but magnified. They were tall as towers, strong as a dozen bulls, but they retained their minds, because after all, it wouldn't do to have these best warriors that were living weapons if they couldn't control their bodies to fight or think about battle the same way. So while the actual Einhari are the total package, when they had kids, not all of those genes transferred. This is where you get units like Ogre, that have the strength of 10 men but the minds of children, or the Stalkers who inherited all of the hunting skills and senses of the greatest warriors, but as a result, they can't stand to be near civilization. It's too much of an affront on their senses. So while this whole group collectively occupies sort of a strange place in Nord society, because on one hand, they are the children of chosen warriors of the gods, just like their forefathers, living proof that the myths of the Nords are true, and then on the other hand, none of them are banging on all cylinders as a result of all this genetic manipulation, right? You have that lofty narrative idea, but then you look at them and you're like, there's something not right. And I want to be clear, like, I'm not calling all of the half-bloods dumb. They all have different unique quirks that offer a godlike boon, but it always seems to be paired with an equally dramatic downside. Almost as if their bodies and minds can't rationalize exactly what they're supposed to be. And the lore in the book actually is super clear about this. It's not a matter of them being the defunct children of gods, but rather they lack ambition or coordination or higher reasoning skills in some sense. If an Ugr really wanted to get smarter or lead or whatever, they probably could. They could probably find a way to do it, at least to a very acceptable degree. They just don't have that X factor that turns them into the superheroes you would kind of expect from their legends. And lastly are the exalted. And these are the best, the brightest, the strongest of the Nord people. Power belongs to those who can take it, and every champion amongst the exalted is a hero who took the power that they wanted. It's led by the High King, which is more of an honorary term more than like a direct title of leadership. It's kind of like calling someone the first among equals kind of thing. This position is commonly held by Arnbjorn, the Einhari ruler of Airheim, but he lets others take the wheel here and there. And if you didn't catch all the importance of his title within that gibberish, Arnbjorn is one of the original demigods that was created, formed into those super soldiers, the Einhari, and acts as the ruler. Which means you have a direct demigod in charge, and this is a dude who has been made to be the perfect soldier, to fight in Ragnarok, but never did. And now he's just this guy who has god-tier strength and power, along with near immortality. And his immediate council, those directly below him as part of the Exalted, are known as his Kjuningir. Sort of like a noble class, but all of them have earned what they have through merit rather than like noble lineage. It's this group and the High King that made the oath with the Jotnar. If you've been wondering how the Nords could have defeated these ice giants and all these things known as Jotnar, but then still take them to battle, this is why. At the end of the Fimbulwinter, the Jotnar were pushed back into the mountains, but some of them seem to have made a deal where they could be called upon in battle. If there was a secret pact made to command the loyalty of the Jotnar, nobody knows about it, because this is not exactly a talkative bunch of warriors and tacticians. They're not the folks that you would ask a lot of questions about. Now, let's wrap this up by asking the question, why is this cool? Right? What makes these three subfactions, even though there's a lot of like, I'm going to say Nordic mythos gibberish is how I'm going to pronounce it. Tongue twisters for me personally. What makes them so unique and so interesting? Well, it's different than other factions like we talked about. Like, they have actual genetic differences rather than just worldviews or reactions, but also at the same time the inverse of that is true. Like, the Nords are such a small group of rugged survivors that have to work together. They actually hold each other in esteem much more than, say, other factions and their sub-factions. So while, say, for example, I picked on the Spires earlier for an example, they seem like a more unified, cohesive army, but within that, they have different, like, levels of citizenship and renown and political leverage. Like, they're kind of at each other's throat, even though they're one unified army. Whereas the Nords, they might look vastly different from one another, but they're actually more cohesive. They're all Nords. They earn what they keep. They are hardy and strong. Some of them have been blessed by the gods. Some are simple mortals seeking, glorious death on the battlefield. But at every level of society, the overarching myth of the Nords is reinforced on a daily basis. Because you're constantly seeing more and more living relics from the time when gods walked amongst men. So rather than dividing these folks based on what's different, their differences inadvertently unite them, as they all share this common mythos and origin of the gods. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know how they can move past this as long as the halfbloods and the Einhari, those original super soldiers, are around. Like, how do you convince people of the truth when there's like living monuments to your mythology walking amongst you. It's a very tough position to be in. But anyway, friends, that's going to do it for me this week. Next week, we're going to take a look at the Nords starter set. If this faction hooked you and you want to jump into it, hope to see you there in the comments of that video. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to the unforgiving wastes of Ea, because today we are talking about the Wadrun, the newest faction for the game Conquest, and I could not be more excited about it, because they have this deeply fascinating history and rich culture, and I'm going to start this series on the Wadrun with a 3-word sales pitch, okay, to get you as excited as I am. Orcs riding dinosaurs. Now that your pulse has sufficiently risen with excitement, I'd like to say that you can save 10% on any of your purchases from Bellum by using my link in the description down below. It is an affiliate link, just to be clear, and it goes an immensely long way to supporting me and my wife and making content like this possible. So thank you to those who have already done so. Now, for those of you who are new to Conquest, first of all, welcome. I have some other videos in my Conquest playlist that will help you get all kinds of caught up, but essentially, this is Bellum's design or take of orcs and casting them into a fresh light, weaving their origins in with the other factions, which goes a long way to making them feel like they really belong in the setting. So with all that preface out of the way, what are the Wadrun? These are, as I said, orc-like creatures. They stand about 7 feet tall, they're full of muscle and designed, that's a key word, designed, from head to toe for war. But we'll get to that in a second. They have a solid fused ribcage, tough skin, and interestingly, one of the most acute senses of hearing of any known creature. That means they're strong, they're resilient, and thanks to their incredible hearing, they can communicate over incredible distances that other races cannot match, which means that they can coordinate their attacks like nobody else. Now, fun fact about that physiology, they actually have more methods to hear than just their ears. They also have sound receptors in their jaws and nasal cavities, which they can focus all to a pinpoint so that they don't get overwhelmed. They can hone in their senses on a specific point so that the din of battle doesn't deafen them and disorient them, but they can hyper-focus to listen to a singular thing. The only real drawback to their build, their physiology, is the sheer amount of energy required to keep it going, meaning they need to slam down an immense amount of food on a daily basis. It does help that they have stomachs that can consume dang near anything. They can eat trash, they could eat wood, all this kinds of stuff, but where they reside, in a harsh desert-like waste of Ea, scarcity is still a very real problem and constantly on their minds, to the point where different tribes will fight and raid one another if starvation reaches that tipping point. But all that said, that's just basic orc stuff. There's a whole lot more going on with this faction. The truth about the Wadrun is that they are a science project run amok, like so many other parts of Conquest. We mentioned in the video on the Nords that they are essentially, their heroes were taken, they had a whole bunch of genetic experiments done on them by the Spires and the Weavers to take local stock, humans, and enhance them to act as a submissive guardian species, right? To outsource the Spire's army. Yeah, we'll just turn these apes into warriors for us. Because the Spires, they, I guess, just don't have time for war, and so they'll make somebody else good at it and have them be our army. And of course, for the Nords, it didn't pan out very well for them. But the thing about the kind of research amongst the Spires when it comes to manipulating life is that it never goes out of style for them, and the different biomancers and scientists were always refining that idea, the core idea of creating a warrior race to defend them. Even if it didn't work on the Nords, there was still something there. The result of further tinkering was a project where no base animal was used, like humans, for example. Instead, they would be genetically designed from the ground up. This warlike race utterly devoted to the Spire and to basically act as both a meat shield and an incredibly deadly standing army. And it took a long time to hammer out the details because the first few batches just wouldn't have that spark of sentience. Right? They would just kind of just be this feral animal, but they wouldn't be able to take commands or create battle plans, nothing like that. They were just too primitive. Until at some point, randomly, specifically 4 Wadrun, known as the Primes, gained sentience. The Spires couldn't understand why these 4 in particular, amongst all the different batches, just all of a sudden gained the spark of life, and they were unable to replicate it. Even when they took the samples from these 4 original Wadrun, they couldn't make it happen again. It's almost like life just had to happen on its own. However, accidental success is still success nonetheless, which is the same approach I had to getting questions right in math class. Now, one thing to note about these 4 primes, as they're called, is that they are actually significantly bigger than the Wadrun that we know in the game. Essentially, these were like, I guess you could call them, jokingly, prime orcs, if you wanted to do that as a 40k joke. But essentially, they were just magnified creations. All the strengths and the drawbacks of their physiology that I mentioned before were just more so. They were bigger, so they were stronger and tougher, but also that meant they had to consume more energy, more calories to be able to keep doing things. So seeing the potential with these 4 primes that they had created, smaller Wadrun were bred until they reached the consistent 7-foot size we mentioned earlier. And again, this was meant to balance their physical prowess and abilities with how much energy they needed to consume. And so from the Spire's perspective, this is a fantastic success. We got 4 primes that are breeding, and we're continuously pruning how they breed so that we get the perfect size of, creature. This is the start of this new race that we've been working on. We don't really quite understand exactly how it all worked out, but hey, we're working with what we got. But there was one more curious thing about these Wadrun that the Spires just couldn't comprehend. You see, the Spires that we understand in the game have never been able to fully grasp magic. They don't use any, okay? It's prevalent on the planet of Ea, but the Spires use all different kinds of their own macabre technology and like living biomechanisms and that kind of stuff. They don't actually use magic, although they have some stuff that seems similar in the game, is distinctly different. So when these progenitor orcs showed signs of tapping into actual magic, it just made them more fascinating. And they remained in this state of reproducing, testing, and examination for some time. Because the Spires they weren't just gonna like unleash these guys all willy-nilly. They had to build it up into a culture and a people group and establish a hierarchy and all these kinds of things and just try to understand magic and the power of sentience, what made it happen in the first place. There's just a lot of things to learn about them. But that all changed abruptly when the Dwaghome, which is sort of the dwarven archetype army that we've talked about here on the channel, went on a warpath and set their sights on the location where the Wadrun project was being held. It is a Spire center known as Abarthth. Now at this point, the Spires are seeing this army coming. They know they don't have the defenses to be able to to make a stand, and so they basically released this fledgling race to defend the site long enough for all the Spire nobles to escape. Now, the battle was a bit rocky until the primes were released. So before this, there's just all the Wadrun. They're kind of scattered, doing little hit-and-run tactics, but not really making a dent in the Dwaghome army. But the moment the primes are unleashed, they just immediately galvanize the entire species into a single, cohesive fighting force, cunning and dangerous. There's something about this kind of leadership and magnetism that they have that sets them apart. So at this point, the Spires are running away, the Wadrun are there fighting their first enemy, the Dwaghome, and I don't know how long this siege or this battle went on for, but it seems to be, some sort of long amount of time, as the Wadrun kept the Dwaghome at bay long enough for everyone to escape, and they were just kind of left to die. Remember, Spires built them for this exact reason, so as long as the research papers made it out, who actually cares about the subjects? We'll just figure out how to recreate them later. Even if it was by accident, we'll figure it out. But the thing is, the Wadrun didn't die. They were beaten, yes, and surrounded, yes. But 3 of those 4 Wadrun primes sacrificed themselves to basically barrel through one flank of Dwaghome and open up a pathway for the rest of them to escape into the harsh wastes. They basically sacrificed themselves to create sort of like a rear guard, I guess you could say, for the rest of whatever was left. There's no idea as to how many Wadrun are actually in, production, quote unquote, at this time. So we don't know how many the actual starting race was once they left the Spires. But this is kind of their origin story. And really, once they got out into the wastes, this is when they kind of became a people of their own. The Dwaghome didn't chase after them because they weren't the target. If you're the Dwaghome hold rake, right, the leader, the commander of his army, and you were going to attack some Spire, and all of a sudden these weird green guys showed up and were harassing you, but then they left, you just go back to attacking the Spire. That's why you're here in the first place. And so now, this fledgling race is out in the wastes where many of them are dying, because they're dying of thirst, starvation, again, the downside of their physique catching up to them. Only one of the 4 primes remained, named Conquest Prime, and after a long time in the desert, she led them to the only place that they ever knew as home, and that is, of course, Abarthth, the facility that was long since destroyed. But again, it's the site where these experiments were born, and it would be the site that they would become the Wadrun that we understand them to be today. Now, I have 3 points here that I really want to stress when it comes to kind of summing up what this faction's about. The first one being is that Abarthth became an oasis. We talked in the Spires videos that we did about how they would basically store huge amounts of biomass, biomaterial, energy, and all these kinds of things deep underground. Essentially, they have like a root network that draws it all in, and then they use that as materials to create all kinds of things, the Wadrun included. These are their reservoirs of just all kinds of nasty, raw organic material to do all their dark creations. But when the Spire itself, like the actual physical structure of the Spire, was destroyed by the Dwaghome, all of that stored material began to leak out and start to greatly enrich the local environment. Remember, the Spire are all about life-giving and mutating power, and so some strange plants started to burst up, forests, water pools, and more. What was meant to be a genetic research plant became an exercise in terraforming by accident. So now we have an environment that is more conducive to life, certainly more so than just wandering the desert like they were, but now the Wadrun have a home, but that home is not quite safe. Because my second point is that the wastes, even with this oasis, are full of life that shouldn't be there. Because the Wadrun were not the only thing being worked on or studied at Abarthth. When the facility went dark, all those plants and trees began to flourish, but so too did other creatures that were kept in stasis. Some of these animals were farming stock, others were alpha predators, but all of them made this oasis a fearsome place to try and live. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this, my sales pitch was orcs riding dinosaurs. And this is where that message makes sense. These colossal beasts, reptiles, dinosaurs, and so on were all the other experiments going on there. And they were just unleashed upon one another to kind of make their own food chain. The Wadrun themselves, designed to be tough and adaptable, took to this challenge immediately, right? Some of these creatures were brought into their own society as beasts of burden or mounts, while some others can't really be tamed so much, but they can still be used as like living war machines of their own design. So while they as a species lack the more powerful magics or intense technology of other factions, they have formed creative uses for the various life forms around them to achieve the same result. And lastly, I have a note here, this is where a culture was born. Now, I'm going to talk more about the Wadrun culture in a future video, but I wanted to mention it here because this moment, timeline-wise, is where it begins. The Spires didn't preset them with a culture and a hierarchy. They had some experiments about like the primes just being bigger ones and kind of corralling them into groups, but it wasn't a culture. That's very different. And so the primes, and now prime singular, had to craft it. And this is where we see things like a rich warrior tradition come into their lives. They have a tribal society built upon oral traditions, storytellings, of their birth and their fight to survive. They revere the warrior, the shaman, the speaker, and they weigh each other's worth by their ability to track and fight and provide sustenance for the tribe. And it's from these kind of seed concepts that the Wadrun race has split into many, many different tribes, governed in different ways and valuing different things, but they all have those same core values that permeate all of them. And so I want to close this video with all of my videos the same way, but talking about why is this so cool? And the truth is, I just love this origin story, right? You'll get some folks, I'm sure they're already in the comments, this isn't all that original, right? Friends, there's nothing new under the sun, right? X Game Company already has orcs that were genetically designed by another race. I don't care. I still love it. What makes this different from other settings is how well they fit into the overall story. Because what we're going to see as we go further and further into more Wadrun lore, they are very much interwoven to other races in this setting in a way that I think is fantastic. The Wadrun are a living example of the hubris of the Spire, but they do so in a way that's very differently to the Nords, right? Where like the Nords were a failure. On terms of an experiment. They took the warriors, they genetically modified them, but they were never awoken in time, and so they didn't serve their purpose, and the Spires up there burned for it. Technically, the actual subjects were successful in that they are super powerful demigods, but the overall experiment of creating an army to defend the Spires up there failed because they weren't woken up. Whereas with the Wadrun, if you look at their story, kind of in contrast, they are pure success. These guys are just straight, like the W in Wadrun is also like for win, because they were made for a purpose. They served that purpose. All the Spires were allowed to escape, and then they just kind of kept going, right? They weren't as disposable as maybe the Spires thought they would be, but they certainly were successful. And because of that success, they became independent, which of course was not intentional, but I love it. It's like, when you kind of factor in the fact that the Spire unleashed all these other animals and this vibrant oasis around it, it is like Jurassic Park also made superhumans. And then all the experiments got out, and the humans that they made were like, we should ride dinosaurs. And everyone was like, yeah, brah. Which is a remaking of that movie that we absolutely need to see. But for all these reasons, I find the lore behind the Wadrun absolutely fascinating. They're this kind of mixture of, a discarded race, kind of like the Nords are, but they have a much firmer understanding of their origins because the Primes and some of those older Wadrun remember their time in the facility. Like they also have living idols of their past, but where the Nords channel that into, their kind of theology, these guys have turned that into a cunning weapon of survival. And for that, they are utterly awesome. So we're going to talk a whole lot more about their culture. There's a lot to go into because they're able to channel different aspects of like primordial power and all these kinds of things. There's so much more to talk about with this faction, but this is your taster, your primer, and I hope that you enjoyed it. So thank you all so much for watching and listening. Like I said before, there is an affiliate link down below if you want to check out some of their models, and every purchase through that link helps support the channel. And if there's enough support for it, I'll keep on doing more and more Warcry content. So I'm excited for it. I love this game. I hope it does really well. And I hope that you enjoy learning more about the Wadrun. Take it easy, all, and happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to the unyielding wilderness of Ea, because today we are talking about the Wadrun. Again, specifically talking about their subfactions. Now, for those of you who are new to the army or Conquest as a whole, I did a breakdown of the army, like in its totality, covering their horrific origins as science experiments of the Spire, how they broke and gained their freedom, and the brutal lessons that this setting has taught them. All of which they have internalized and overcome, and have asserted themselves as rightful heirs to their own destiny, a fully fledged people group with the ability to chart their own path. Now, I'll put a link to that video in the description down below, but there's so much more going on from that kind of starting place, because any faction with an inception this chaotic is going to have some very complex problems, and different ways that they approach those problems to handle them. Now, normally when I do these sub-faction lore bits, there's like a singular event, and then each sub-faction represents how people respond to it. This is pretty true of like the Spires and the 100 Kingdoms, that kind of stuff. But much like the Nords in specific, that is not the case here. Each sub-faction instead represents a different portion of the Wadrun populace, marked by different gifts, quote-unquote gifts, from their makers. And while they can be taken in 3 different ways, as each sub-faction has its own rules, don't forget that they're all one people. Unity has been their greatest weapon till this point. So even though some sub-factions favor a particular kind of unit, it's not theme-breaking to take whatever you want, provided that you follow the rules for army building, right? It all makes sense. They all work together. Whatever the tribe needs, they will support. And so there's no, like, is this lore-friendly list? Like, it all is. It's one tribe, one people, but there are different types of Wadrun even within the grand header of the tribe. And those are the tribes, the cults, and the speakers. So let's break into each one of these and figure out what they're all about. First up are the tribes, and the tribes form the overwhelming bulk of the Wadrun race, so it's a great place to start. Essentially, every Wadrun falls into one of 2 categories: warriors or bound. In this context, bound means you're bound to the tribe, so we'll explain what that means in a bit. The warriors are pretty self-explanatory. Unlike the super petty means of determining acumen like humans have, where noble lineages can afford martial training and better weapons and all these kinds of stuff and live different from farmers, each Wadrun must earn their right to march on the battlefield, and achieves this by passing a series of trials. Those that succeed become braves and warriors. This is how we get the basic fighting force that you and I can interact with on a table. Those that fail become bound. Again, a term that's short for bound to the tribe. And this is an interesting thing. We talked about it quite a bit in part 1 of this series on the Wadrun, and that is that the nutritional requirements for these guys, the Wadrun as a whole, are so massive that a huge part of their populace has to be centered around farming. Like, a majority of the population serves as bound, acting as farmers, gatherers, and so on, doing what they can to keep the tribe fed. And it's not really expressly said how many, bound there are to warriors, but I kind of get the sense of like the 80-20 rule. Like, the overwhelming majority of people are out there just trying to supply food for the faction because they do, like, nutritional requirements are a massive part of their lore. It's actually one of the drawbacks to their design when the Spires were creating them. So it's like always on the forefront of their mind is the next meal. But what's interesting to me is that being bound is not a negative thing. Both classes, the warriors and the bound, are respected evenly because one cannot function without the other. The warriors can't fight without food. Again, the expenditure of energy when it goes to battle with these guys is huge. And then also, the farmers would just die if they got attacked by anything, so they need defenders, the warriors, to guard them while they do their job. Now, as far as how the Wadrun are governed, right, and this applies to the tribes, but it kind of represents how all of them interact. The Wadrun have an kind of like a tribal structure, like a bunch of elder council type figures, and this is repeated across every single tribe, and they're led by a council of 5. A chieftain to represent the tribe's warriors, a mistress to represent the bound, a predator who stands for the speakers, who we'll talk about in a moment. There is a scion to represent all of the cults, and a shaman to represent the elders, so someone who has wisdom of people who have lived many winters, kind of a thing. So that's everything from warriors, the people that work to feed them and be defended by them, their religious affiliations, their leaders, their beasts of burden, their animals, all of those things are factored into this. And this council of 5 works together to settle any disputes or decide any real course of action. But what's interesting is that none of these figures claim to have real authority. They are but servants in different ways. The true leader, as always, is their living goddess, one of the original primes to escape during the race's creation. And all of this other things, like, the council of 5 leaders representing the warriors and the bound and all that kind of stuff, this is just ways to peacefully delegate her authority. The tribes represent the core and beating heart of the Wadrun. They are the numbers, the might, the muscle, as well as the machine that feeds resources to any war effort they want to engage in with each tribe. So moving on, there is the cults. So the cults are one thing that we didn't touch on too much in the last video, and think of these as specializations that tap into some aspect of the primordial gods of the setting. And here's how I wrap my head around that. The Wadrun were forged as like empty vessels. No one knows why, but it seems that the primordial gods, death, famine, war, and conquest, were able to somehow tap into their psyche. If it weren't for the mind and discipline of the surviving prime, the Wadrun probably would have fallen to the various impulses and desires of each primordial god to their own destruction. Instead, she acknowledged what was happening and changed these impulses from self-destructive habits to laser-focused discipline. So any member of the tribe that begins getting pulled or led by one of the primordial gods can temper it into something useful for the tribe. This is how I'm explaining it to myself. The cult of war is, of course, centered around the primordial god of war. Well, the Wadrun Prime was able to shape war's affiliation to Earth and mold, that primordial god in the role of a crafter as well. So to this day, the cult of war are the only Wadrun allowed to cast and forge metal, the spiritual manifestation of their god. So I took the impulse for, war and just destruction, and I turned it into a tool for us as a tribe. You make the weapons. You want to be imbued with the power of war, make the weapons and the armor. Now, for the cult of death, there's kind of a misnomer with that name. You see, this is essentially the cult of midwives and healers. So rather than embracing death, the cult accepts the reality of it, but battles it to their last breath. Almost exclusively composed of females, this cult is, not surprisingly, the most popular and influential amongst the tribes, for the work that they do is invaluable. These are your healers. They could be doing things to help crops grow, all kinds of stuff that would be very, very useful and practical on a day-to-day level. Then there is the cult of famine. Now the Prime could do very, very little to kind of temper the hunger and drive that fanatics would get into when they were kind of falling to the sway of famine. Today, the cult of famine travels the lands exhaustively, almost compulsively, seeking new stories and myths to record, relentlessly expanding the modest collection of Wadrun history and myth and songs, and basically trying to build their heritage. They want to go out and they want to consume everything they can find around them, to understand the world, to basically take it all in as an amalgamation of their culture. And lastly, there's the cult of conquest, and this is perhaps the most subtle manipulation of all, and that is the Prime herself is all about conquest. Her understanding of the primordial nature of conquest has, over the years, evolved away from the literal embodiment of expansion and domination to one of vision, victory, and adaptability. And so these are the cults that we have to work with: conquest, famine, death, and war. Each one of those takes some Wadrun who are unique and pulls them in different directions, giving them all different kinds of skill sets and abilities, and they walk a fine line between pinpoint focus that makes them deadly to enemies and wild fanaticism that makes them dangerous to the tribe. And the leaders who roll in these circles are not immune to that either. So if your base level is a warrior or a farmer, these are all the specialists that kind of go into making a civilization progress. They're engaging with all the world around them. They're tempering steel. They're healing. They're absorbing culture. There's just a lot going on within the context of the cults. Now, the third subfaction is my personal favorite, and those are the speakers. One thing we mentioned in my last video was that there were some unintended consequences in the birth of the Wadrun. For example, the Spires somehow created a magic-wielding race despite not understanding how magic works on this planet at all. Well, there was another unintentional gift, we'll put that in quotes, and this is what the speakers have. To put it simply, these are Wadrun that somehow understand how to communicate with certain wild species, specifically the ones within their environment. It could be something that the Spire were testing on other subjects and the Wadrun got mixed into that, like maybe there was some experiment to have these species interact in a specific way, so you would want to have the Wadrun be able to communicate or control them. Or it could be totally new, just a complete genetic offshoot. There's no idea because all the records are gone. That whole facility is destroyed. However, there does seem to be a form of pattern to it. For example, females tend to communicate more with carnivores, males more with herbivores. And this is essentially how they can use the huge monsters and dinosaurs and beasts of burden and all those kinds of cool things that make this faction so unique. Speakers today are invaluable to a growing Wadrun society and population because they, again, use their companions as beasts of burden, it aids them in construction and defenses, and basically growing Wadrun habitats and populations. And this is where we get the dinosaurs part of the Orcs on Dinosaurs sales pitch I did in the first episode. So now I want to end this video like I end all of them by simply asking the question, why is this cool? Well, one of my favorite things about the Wadrun is that, like, unity is a theme rather than domination, right? So it could be easily said that, with the humans in this setting, you have peasants who are forced to work in fields, and then you have nobles who lord over them and that kind of stuff. Here, the theme is unity. No one is subjugated below anybody else. We're all just working together, but we have these methods and these trials and these disciplines to figure out where everyone is strongest. Whether you're strongest supporting the tribe and making sure we all have food, well, being a provider is one of the highest and most important valued things within the tribe because of their dietary needs. If it's a warrior, you have to be really good at fighting. If it's a cult, you get pinpoint focused into a specific aspect of the world that benefits the tribe as a whole. Like, again, there's like tiers of authority, but not domination where someone is subjugated below somebody else. The warrior class doesn't rule. They work alongside the beasts, not just domesticate and dominate them. They have speakers who work with them. And this taps into how their government system works, how the population has to be sort of kind of kept in control because of their dietary needs. Like, all these kinds of things are just crazy awesome. And it's all because they have to work together, I think more so than any other faction in this game. And what's interesting is that working together also involves their environment, the beasts that they can communicate with, the fields that they work that directly relate to how much of a population they can have because of how much food they have to produce. All these kinds of things go into making this a very cool, fleshed out faction. I love all three of these sub-factions just for different reasons, what they represent. The cult one is a little bit esoteric in terms of like how they worded it. It's a little bit harder to understand, but the truth of the matter is, like, I love the idea of disciplines, right? I mean, that's kind of how I think about the cults, is just sum it up as saying disciplines. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and close out there for this episode. Thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I'd love to see in the comments down below which of these three you like the most. For me, again, speakers, gotta have them dinos. Dinos for days. Shut up and give me my dinos. I love it. Let me know your thoughts down below and I will read them then. Thank you so much, and I will catch you next time. Happy wargaming. Welcome, fellow humans, to the ever-deadly plains of Ea, because today we are talking about the 100 Kingdoms. That is a faction within the game Conquest, the last argument of kings. And one thing I will add right up top here, if you like this video and you're interested in this faction, please consider using my affiliate link in the description down below. It'll save you 10% on all purchases from Bellum, and it goes an immensely long way to supporting me, my wife, our cat, this channel, all of it. So thank you so much to all those folks who have already used that link. For those of you who are new to Conquest or this particular faction, the 100 Kingdoms are the base humans of the setting. They have not been manipulated on a genetic level like the Nords, nor were they an accidental creation like the Wadrun or the Dwaghome. They present themselves as the classic Renaissance style of knights. You have men-at-arms and squires and spellcasters and so on. And so if you like those kinds of classic fantasy heroes, ordinary men and women facing unspeakable horrors, this is the faction for you. Now, I'm going to cover the sub-factions in more detail later on in a separate video, once we establish some foundational lore, but understand something very, very important up top here. As the humans of this setting, they likely have the most diverse range of motivations and influences leading them to war. This means we can have armies built around innumerable battles, with different goals and methods of war, and so this is truly an army that can be whatever you want it to be lore-wise. Everything from crusading zealots to a small local warlord using knights to defend his petty fiefdom, even spiritual successors to the near demigod-like legions that is a deep part of their cultural heritage. My point is, this is a monster of a faction with all the options that you have, and as a player, you can build a whole city around whatever interests you about them. But there is a ton more going on here than just copy-paste of Bretonnians of old, because this is a faction that is born from strife, and the many responses to those traumatic origins give us a vastly different kind of people. Now, up front, I want to say that the origins of humanity in the Conquest setting are deeply fascinating. They have a whole unique backstory. However, that is a story for a different video because it is utterly intertwined with a completely separate faction known as the Dominion. So rather than being a history of man, I want this to be a history of the 100 kingdoms, picking up when humanity reaches that point. These are humans that ended up far from home as refugees plunged into a universe of horrors. Because the story of the 100 kingdoms really begins as the remnants of humanity are fleeing the Dominion over the Clostrian mountains headed west to the Bitter Sea. Again, we're going to cover what brought humanity to that point in a dedicated video, but our heroes arrive ragged and worn from days of travel in panic. Now, this moment, their birth as a faction of the 100 kingdoms, represents a massive reset button being pressed on society. Before, in the Dominion, they were very well established with a priesthood and political structure and all of those things, but it was all thrown in a blender. And when society moved over to their current location, it regressed. It went backwards to the most common form of power that there is, which is gangs and local warlords. Those refugees with the most coin or influence were able to stake a claim of land early on and band together a crude workforce and military arm, and so feudalism, in all of its primal glory, I guess we can call it, reigned for a very long time. And so this fractious nature is what led to the name the 100 Kingdoms, as in humanity in this region is composed of a whole bunch of these tiny pockets of feudal power, each a kingdom unto themselves. Now, I don't think 100 is an exact number, but you get the idea. They're just kind of stating there's a lot of us. And at this point, each kingdom wars against each other for land and workers and military rights and all these kinds of things, but they also have to defend themselves from stuff like the Spire and the Dwaghome and Nord raids on the coast. Every one of these little kingdoms is an island unto themselves at this point. And the reason that they have all these threats around them is because, remember, they were refugees. They came into this land that have already had Dwaghome towers existing for forever and spires and all these different Nord raids already coming down. Like, they just walked into the killing field, essentially. And so if they want the space, they need to carve it out for themselves too. But if there is one constant in life, it is change. And as the generations passed from these very crude, like I said, refugee-style clans and civilizations, these very individual little kingdoms began to evolve and work together more and more out of necessity for survival than anything else. And so once they started being able to function together as a team, then we saw significant social, adaptation. So things like trade routes, right? Political hierarchies, aristocracies, and so on. And soon enough, an excess in population gave rise to an entire new class of person, and that is the mercenary. Now, these individual little tiny warlords, they didn't have to capture workers or use farmers to defend their land. Now they could hire armies. And in return, these armies could work for a number of these minor warlords. And this was a major destabilization of power because now, Someone who has no army but lots of wealth can all of a sudden amass a huge martial force and go take on their competitors. In addition to that, now it means that the average person can strike out on their own and make a real bit of money without having to subjugate themselves below a warlord. They could work in trade, they could work as a warrior professionally, or anything like that. So society, like I said, it hit a reset button, but all of a sudden, okay, now the gears are turning. We're kind of like seeing history play itself out again in terms of how we evolve and grow and build upon systems that came before. But as much as things always change, there are plenty of people who hate that change, and what a great way to keep people in line, even if they don't work for a warlord, but religion. Strict, harsh, demanding religion. Now we're going to talk more about the actual subfactions of faith here in tomorrow's video, but as a quick note to understand, the modern church within the 100 Kingdoms is an extremely powerful and divided faction. Some of these, rulers of their own little kingdom will wield religious faith and devotion as a weapon, while others see it more as a means of control and commerce. But no matter how sincere an adherent may be, there is no denying that the Theist Church, as it's called, is a powerful faction within the 100 Kingdoms simply because it supersedes petty boundaries. It can act as a back channel for these various kings, warlords, there's aristocracy members to work together, to unite and divide, all without having to declare a full war upon one another. And when the church does declare war on an outside force or internal rebellion, they can summon huge armies of faithful zealots from across all of the kingdoms and of course hire mercenaries to stomp out any and all resistance. Now, as I end all these videos, I always like to talk about why I think this is cool, and honestly, to be totally fair, like there's not a ton of like super extravagant fantasy when it comes to the foundation of the 100 Kingdoms. They do have a pretty fantastic origin before then, but like I said, it just requires its own video to talk about. But as far as the founding of this as a faction that you and I can engage with, well, functionally, you and I take the role as either a super general, or it could be one of the warlords of one of these 100 kingdoms, and we are essentially assembling a fighting army and going out and picking a fight with somebody else, whether it's another 100 Kingdoms player or any of the other factions. And for me, as a huge fan of history, I love this stuff. The move from feudalism to a more, I'm going to say, civil era, I mean, things don't feel particularly civil all the time, but you know what I mean, is deeply fascinating to me. The idea that the technology of roads and trade and all of a sudden this burgeoning middle class of people who are happy to sell themselves out as mercenaries changed the world in immense ways, and it condenses hundreds of years of change into like 4 paragraphs, which for me is just like, yay! And what I like about it is their history, at least for the forming of the 100 Kingdoms, is very relatable. I mean, if you're looking for the humans of the fantasy setting and that's just what you identify with and that's what you like, absolutely, like the 100 Kingdoms are a fantastic representation of what humans would be like if they were dropped into this hellscape where it's just a dude with a sword versus all kinds of T-Rexes and fire machines and flesh horrors and trolls and giants. Like, that's just a few things from the various other factions that they have to deal with. Like, I totally get why that's awesome. At the same time, hitting the reset button on society allows you and I to go in and you can just pick a part of the Parabellum map that they have on their main page and just be like, I want to really flesh out this part. And so you can really design your own little fiefdom, and you can kind of articulate why the forces of your army are coming together. You can deem, yourself to be affiliated with either the Theist or the Deist church, which we'll talk about the differences tomorrow, but you can really flesh all of that lore out because they are such a versatile army with so many units to represent so many different things. And certainly compared to the other factions in the setting, nobody has nearly as much infighting. Like, the Spires will conspire against one another because they all want to raise in stature, but they're all, for the most part, playing the same game. Sovereign's game, so to speak. But, when you look at the Dwaghome, yeah, each hold is isolated, but they do have a structure within each one of them. The Nords are generally all on the same page because it's just survival of the clan over everything else. And so we look at this faction of humans, like, you have enough resources and time to fight amongst yourself. What a luxury that the other factions in this setting do not have. And if you just got it together and unified, they were unified at one point into one empire, but that crumbled and fell apart. Well, if you could do that again, you could really stake a claim and have very secure borders. You could do anything you wanted. But unfortunately, the fractious nature of mankind and how duplicitous we can be and how we are all out for our own self-interest a lot of the times, especially as, rulers of these minor little kingdoms, it leads to our own weakness. And so I thought this was a great snapshot of just what would it actually be like if humans were dropped into this setting, right? I mean, the 100 Kingdoms evolved the way that we evolved, in a societal way at least, and they continue to have the flaws that we have. And so again, if you're looking to identify with your fantasy, if you like humans in these settings, I think Parabellum did a great job and really kind of put them into the spotlight here between their origins with the Dominion, which of course I'm going to do a dedicated Dominion video, but also how they are attacked on all sides, inward and outward, from enemies at home and abroad. So friends, thank you all so much for watching this video. I'm going to follow up tomorrow by talking about the various sub-factions, which, starting with the 100 Kingdoms, it's such a huge army that it really does require breaking it down into those sub-factions to truly understand the different social influences and military influences that make them an interesting and compelling army to follow. So I do hope that you watch that video, and I will catch you there. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and happy wargaming. Welcome, knights and nobles, to the unrelenting horrors of Ea, because today we are talking about the various sub-factions of the 100 Kingdoms. I just did a video on them yesterday, really going into more depth about sort of their origin story, and I pointed out that this is the story of the 100 Kingdoms, not the story of mankind, and so we're going to focus specifically on the events that led them as they crossed over the mountain ranges over to the west by the Bitter Sea, how they went from a bunch of refugees to a huge collection of individuals, warlords, fiefdoms, and kingdoms to become the army that you and I get to play with on the tabletop. Now, one thing I'd like to add up top is that if you like this video and you're interested in this faction, please consider using my affiliate link in the description below. It'll save you 10% on all your purchases through Parabellum and goes a super long way to helping support me, my wife, and this channel. So thank you so much to all the people who have already done that. Now, in my part 1, just as a short brief synopsis, these are the ordinary men and women of the setting that are armed with little more than faith sometimes and a dull sword, out here fighting every kind of monster imaginable. But there's a lot going on because of the fractious nature of humanity and the evolution of their society from this primal feudalism at first to a massive system of interconnected kingdoms with politics and religion and more. So today we are going to take a brief dive into the various sub-factions of the 100 Kingdoms and get you a sense of what the various influences and forces for these guys are like. And keep in mind, and I want to say this right up top, any given kingdom within the 100 Kingdoms is going to feel pressure from all of these sub-factions. It's not like you pick your one and that's a whole city's devoted to that. One faction may, of course, be the primary, modus operandi of an entire kingdom, but collectively, the influences from every single one of these is going to be felt in every single kingdom. And so we're going to start our discussion with the orders. And again, this is where I point out that the history of humanity is much more than the history of the 100 Kingdoms. The orders are descended from a military legion that safeguarded humanity as it fled west, away from the Dominion. Now, the reason for that will be explained in a dedicated video, but a single legion from the many that existed survived that dark time and set itself up to defend humanity in this strange new world by the Bitter Sea. So you have these warriors of incredible power that are brave and honorable, but they don't have a government all of a sudden. They have no social structure, and so they're trying to defend everybody, but they're like, things are falling apart very aggressively, and so it's just this problem where people didn't want to be governed by soldiers because that's just martial law, nor did this remaining legion want the responsibility of governing alone. Because even internally, they were disagreeing on how best to guide and defend humanity. So what you and I call the orders in Conquest are just different factions, all descended from that original legion, who have different ideas on how to lead. Some of them want to lead and defend humanity by the sword, in sort of like a might makes right mentality, with some others thinking that, money and social influence are the key to basically unifying humanity. Regardless, these collections of Legion descendants are extremely powerful as a collective faction within the 100 Kingdoms. I mean, there's something about them, the way that they trained, their equipment, their discipline, that has given them near superhuman abilities in battle. Like, it thoroughly matters that this one military legion had descendants at all. And they work to make sure that neither the nobility, which is just the rich people from all across the 100 Kingdoms, or the church itself do not fully subjugate the course of human development. They kind of work as a free agent, largely, and whatever they think threatens the greater freedom of the 100 Kingdoms, they address it. Right? If someone reports a Dwaghome incursion, the heck you are, and the orders are going to come right down there and stomp it out. And I guess kind of when I think about the orders, I think of them almost like paladins, right? They're these holy warriors who operate as an independent force and can defend humanity, and not wholly in a religious sense, but that there is something sort of divine about them. Their strength and their abilities is far greater than the average person, so there's something about them. But they are also bogged down in the squabbles of how best to achieve the goal of defending humanity, and they are not immune to the pettiness of man. And so this kind of, wrestling with their own humanity and being sort of demigods on the battlefield, it puts them in this weird place where they're like, we don't just want to have martial law and lead, though they could have at one point, but all of those influences going to making them a super interesting faction, and you can really splash it into any part of your army, right? You just say that they're on their own mission, maybe a warlord hired them just to kind of help them deal with a problem with another faction. There's all kinds of reasons why the orders would join an army, but they really do act as sort of their own free agent that you can build upon and expand and bring into your faction, or you can just ignore them. Now, the next subfaction we're going to talk about are the Nobility, and no human-centric faction would be complete without a intense reminder of the fleeting pettiness and short-sightedness of mankind, and for that, I present to you the Nobility. When the first humans came over mountains and headed west from the Dominion, nobility was just, it was some strong air quotes around the word noble, and it was basically defined by whoever could take and hold land, right? Very primal, very might makes right kind of a thing. But as things mellowed out, the orders we mentioned basically went around and cleared out bandit kingdoms and minor warlords and anyone on the level, meaning you could keep a population alive, you could defend your land, you weren't a tyrant outright, you had farmers, workers, and military stuff. Well, they were allowed to remain, thus birthing a new tier of nobility. Lots of landowners, regents, warlords, that kind of thing. And while the orders have been huge in shaping the overall structure of the 100 Kingdoms, by defending it and that kind of stuff, and the church has been steadily influencing its citizens' worldviews, no change can happen without two things: raw manpower and money. And that's where the nobility fit into this kind of ecosystem. They own the land that has the mines. The mines have the ore for making metal. The metal is needed for weapons and armor. They have the fields that provide the food for entire crusades. They hire soldiers and support trade. They facilitate the societies that the church and the orders strive to influence and control. And those are all super awesome things. But the problem is that each kind of pocket, I guess you could say, of nobles, because the 100 Kingdoms just does not want to unify, each of them is an island unto themselves, convinced that they alone will endure the test of time. If they accrue enough resources or power or social clout, then they can come out on top and reign above the entire 100 Kingdoms. In fact, that name, 100 Kingdoms, is a testament to the fickle nature of the nobility, because they like things separated, because then it becomes a game that can be played and won. There have been times where the 100 Kingdoms were united as a single empire, as I mentioned before, but it keeps falling apart because of the greed and the short-sightedness of nobles and people in the church, and even the order themselves. So while they do add a lot to the ongoing growth of humanity as a whole, it's nothing compared to what they would be if they were able to unite. Now, the third faction to cover here is that of the Faith, and this is kind of a broad term here because it underpins the drama between refugees trying to become nation builders, the orders trying to keep it all together, and petty warlords and tyrants trying to assert themselves as nobility. But behind all of that is the common everyday man just trying to understand why all of this is happening. And so to service that need for understanding, they turn to the church. And essentially the church is divided into two camps. There's the theist and the deist. And these are essentially two ways of interpreting the tragic events that led to mankind running away from the Dominion after the fall and ending up here as refugees having to rebuild themselves as the 100 Kingdoms. Now, like I said, we're going to talk about the fall of the Dominion in a separate video, but whether or not you know the facts about the fall is irrelevant, because what we're talking about is what the churches say happened, of course, and that's a very different thing. So first up, we'll tackle the theists. In their mind, it was mankind that fell from grace, as if we, collectively, were on the wrong path in the before times of the Dominion, and we were essentially cast out by the gods for our transgressions, and much of humanity was wiped out as punishment for those sins, and those that were left alive were the chosen, and we have been given a chance to rebuild, humanity and society on the foundation of the true righteous faith. So there's lots of elements of, guilt, inadequacy, that kind of stuff, where we have been cast out of the divine place and we need to repent and change and that kind of stuff. So kind of a classic, I guess you could say, fire and brimstone-y type thing. The other side of the faith are the deists. And so I'm actually just going to read what they wrote about the deists because I think it is probably the best synopsis possible. The deist creed argues that the fall of the divinity was due to mankind and its flawed vision of perception. They argue that God is a perfect distillation of man, rather than man being an imperfect copy of God, and that our limited perception of this perfection twisted what was once whole and pure through need and prayer, warping it so badly it fell. They argue that the only way for humanity to worship the divine is by choosing to worship those aspects we each understand and embody the best. Thus, to come closer to divinity, one needs not to be born among the chosen, quote-unquote, but to embody the aspects of the divine as closely as possible. So it's a lot less of a, here's a fantasy take on history, but rather the true faith is by putting into practice the best values that we can hope to ascend to. But the problem with that, as your thesis statement for life and governance, is that there is a clear lack of definition. Right, I'm all for leaning into self-improvement, but there's not a rigid structure, and so people will always drift away into pockets of intense zealotry around whatever they think the key, trait is. Again, quote, it says, the only way for humanity to worship the divine is by choosing to worship those aspects we each understand and embody the best. That can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and when you magnify that across the number of 100 kingdoms to the number of different deist churches within them, you can understand why there would be a lot of misunderstandings from church to church. But both of these philosophies and religious structures exist simultaneously. They each cater to different types of people and the petty warlords who rule them. Some nobles find it useful as a political tool to align themselves to one or another, and so the power of the church will wax and wane region to region. Also, it's important to remember that because the enemies around mankind are only getting more deadly and more crazy, I guess you could say, the intensity of these faiths is also on the rise, especially as mankind gets bigger and stronger and able to really ask the hard questions about its own origin. And so the way that the book posits this kind of thing is that wars of faith are on the rise and they are inevitable. There's going to be a day where the deist and theist church have to have it out. Now, the last faction, and I'm going to put an asterisk next to that term, are the Imperial remnants. So this is sort of like a little side thing. I mentioned a few times in this video and the last that there was a point in time where the 100 kingdoms were unified into one Imperial Empire. The Imperial remnants are one last little group or some measure of military and political power based on that. When that empire collapsed, the Imperial military that acted as the centralized forces of the Emperor himself refused to disband. And as the unity of the empire crumbled to infighting between the nobility, the orders, and the churches, all those things we talked about, the faithful guard of the emperor himself refused to yield or dissipate. And so what they did was they went to the land that the emperor had owned for himself. Huge cut of land, all that kind of stuff, and they claimed ownership of it. They basically squatted on that property. And then they did the same thing with the mint, meaning currency production, whoever makes your money. And then they did it again with the halls of learning and knowledge. And so just by retaining these things that any of the 100 kingdoms need to seize absolute power, they had become a power unto themselves. So they kind of act as this reminder of days of unity past, while also ensuring that no one gets a little bit too much power in their pocket. You essentially control the bank, a whole bunch of very valuable land, and the places where learning and higher education can happen. They don't rule, of course, they don't try to rule, they simply keep things in balance. Because in a way, they are the unofficial means that keep all of the 100 kingdoms on a playing field together. Trade can happen thanks to a unified currency. There's vast wealth to be had from the resources of the Imperial remnants' lands. The best people can be trained at their academies, and they can even act as judges for lesser disputes. Their leader is known as the Chamberlain, which is a largely honorary title that puts the full might of the Imperial remnants behind a sole personality. And so I want to end this video like I end all of them, asking why is this so cool? And I think, honestly, after having gone through all 4 of these sub-factions, the real thing that I find interesting is the fact that they all exist simultaneously. Any warlord who controls any kingdom, right? No matter how regal you think you are, whether you're a very noble leader and part of the aristocracy and you're very, benevolent, or you're a tyrant who just works people to death, you are going to feel the influences all 4 of these sub-factions. And then you could call it 5 sub-factions because their church is divided between the theists and the deists. So that's a lot of push and pull, and when we look at things like historical, let's say pre-World War I Europe, you get that same kind of sense. There are so many influences going on at the same time as your society is changing and evolving at an unprecedented pace. Because now we have, trade routes between people. We have a church that can kind of act as a buffer between nation states. There's just a lot of political intrigue and ness. It's just humanity gets very messy when it reaches a certain point. This is that point. And so I like the fact that I feel like the 100 Kingdoms is a snapshot into one of the most interesting points in human history in terms of our actual development in the real world, but it's layered into this fantasy setting where empires are unifying and toppling, and there's outside threats and inside threats. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And as someone who loves stories and engaging tales and loves that people have the freedom to write their own, it's just an absolute sandbox for all kinds of great storytelling. I'm also a huge sucker for a zealot army. I don't know why it is. Whether it is, Menoth from War Machine or like Bone Splitters and Fire Slayers from AOS. I love the idea of just a bunch of really angry zealots just going headlong because it's such a terrifying notion. But friends, that's my thoughts on the sub-factions of the 100 Kingdoms. I hope that you enjoyed this video as much as I did narrating it. Let me know your thoughts about the 100 Kingdoms in the comments down below. I'd love to know which one's your favorites. Again, obviously mine, the priests, even just the priest model is just the most baller thing ever. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on that. So leave it down below. I will catch you next time. Happy wargaming.